Hi there, and thank you for choosing to spend this quiet hour with me tonight instead of 100 other things you could be doing right now. Wherever you are right now, whatever kind of day brought you here, get comfortable because we are about to travel further back in time than almost any story you have ever heard. Most people picture the earliest humans as little more than grunting animals, dragging clubs through the dirt, thinking about nothing beyond hunger and fear and staying warm. No art, no planning, no inner life worth speaking of. But in a quiet cave on the southern coast of Africa 100,000 years ago, someone was already mixing paint, not scratching at a wall out of boredom, following an actual recipe, with tools, with a container, with a plan. Tonight we're going back to the very edge of what it means to be human, to the 100,000 years before anything we would call civilization ever existed. Before we step into that story, if this kind of journey is something you enjoy, a like on this video, a subscribe, or even a quick comment would mean more than you might think. And I would love to know one simple thing. Where in the world are you tonight, and what time is it right where you're sitting? I like picturing all of you scattered across so many different time zones, drifting towards sleep together. Now go ahead and dim the lights if you can, and maybe switch on a fan or something with a soft, steady hum in the background. And when you are ready, let's begin. Picture a narrow limestone cave perched above a wild, cold stretch of ocean at the very tip of Africa. The sound of waves rolls in and out of the entrance like breathing. Outside, gulls cry over rocks slick with morning mist. Inside, in the reddish half-light near the cave mouth, a woman is crouched over a flat stone. In one hand she holds a rounded, iron-rich rock streaked orange and deep red. In the other, a fist-sized cobble, and she is grinding slowly, turning solid stone into fine bright powder. This is not a random act. She's done this before. Her movements are practiced almost ritual. Scrape, grind, scrape again. Beside her, tucked into the sand, sit two large abalone shells, their insides shimmering faintly in the low light. One already holds a small pool of thick red paste. Every so often she pauses. She dips one finger into the mixture, testing how it moves, how thick it feels against her skin. Too dry and it will crumble and fall away. Too wet and it will run before it ever sets. She adds a little more fat, a little more marrow, works it through with slow, patient strokes, until the colour finally sits right. Somewhere deeper in the cave, other members of her group move quietly through their own small tasks. But this corner, this particular stretch of firelight and stone belongs to her. She almost certainly had no idea that people would spend entire careers 100,000 years later studying the exact angle of her grinding strokes. This scene is not pulled out of thin air. It comes from a real place, a real excavation on the southern coast of South Africa at a site called Blombos Cave. And the woman we are picturing stands in for real people who did exactly this roughly 100,000 years ago. Archaeologists, directed by a South African researcher named Christopher Henshelwood, spent years carefully removing sand layer by careful layer from that cave floor. And in one of the deepest, oldest layers they found something almost impossible for its age. Two abalone shells still holding the dried remains of a deliberate ochre-rich paint. Beside them lay the tools that made it. A grinding stone. A hammer stone. A bone tool likely from a seal used to stir the mixture and scrape it free. Even small traces of animal fat and marrow worked directly into the pigment. For a long time, the story most of us were taught went something like this. Real human thinking, real art, real culture only began around 40,000 years ago, mostly in Europe, with painted caves and carved little figurines. Everything before that stage was supposed to be simple, instinctive, barely different from an animal following its nose. But this shell, this paint, and this careful multi-step recipe push that story back by more than 60,000 years, and they push it out of Europe entirely back to a rocky African shoreline that most people have never even heard of. Part of the reason the older story lasted so long has nothing to do with the evidence itself and everything to do with where people were digging. For most of the last century, the caves of France and Spain received the bulk of the funding, the bulk of the famous archaeologists, and almost all of the public attention. Africa, where our species actually began, was treated as a footnote. So when a small team spent years quietly sifting through sand on a remote stretch of the South African coast and pulled out a 100,000-year-old paint kit, it did more than add one more artifact to a museum shelf. It forced an entire field of scientists to admit that they had been looking in the wrong place for the wrong story. So what was this paint actually for? Was it smeared across skin for protection from sun and biting insects? Was it used to soften and preserve animal hides, or did it mean something else entirely? A mark of identity, a signal to everyone else in the group, this is who I am. Researchers are still divided. Some argue the purpose was mostly practical. Ochre has real physical properties. It can shield skin, discourage insects, and even help toughen leather, so a substance this useful would have spread simply because it worked. Others see something more happening here. They point out that this exact recipe, this exact pairing of shell stone and pigment, shows up again and again in the same layers of sand, suggesting it was not a lucky accident. It was a tradition, something taught, something carried carefully from one pair of hands to the next. There is a small human comfort in noticing that we still have not fully answered this question about ourselves. Even in laboratories today, ochre keeps surprising the people who study it. It turns out this particular reddish stone really is good at repelling insects and softening leather. And yet in cave after cave across this region, it also shows up in patterns, too deliberate, too repeated, too carefully, chosen to be pure accident. It behaves like something useful and something meaningful tangled together so tightly that separating the two may simply be the wrong question to ask. Maybe it was practical, maybe it was symbolic, or, and this might be the quietest possibility of all, maybe for the woman grinding that stone there was never any difference between the two. Maybe protecting her skin and marking her identity were simply the same single act. A fair question probably just crossed your mind. How can anyone possibly claim to know the age of a shell that precisely 100,000 years after the fact? It is a fair thing to wonder. And scientists take it seriously too. They are not simply guessing based on how deep something sits in the sand. They measure the grains of sand themselves using the tiny trapped signal of light energy that builds up inside a buried mineral grain over time ever since it last saw sunlight. It is a strange kind of clock buried in the ground itself, and it is checked and rechecked layer against layer, site against site, before any number is ever published. This is not folklore dressed up as fact. It is careful, patient, repeatable science. And it is exactly how we know that this particular story is not 100 years old or even 10,000. It is 100,000. Here is the detail that turns this from a curiosity into something almost staggering. This exact recipe, this exact way of grinding, mixing, and storing red pigment was not a one-time event inside a single cave. Researchers have found the same style of processing using the same kinds of tools, appearing again in layers separated by tens of thousands of years. Taken together, the evidence suggests this tradition was practiced on and off for at least 25,000 years. Sit with that number for a moment. All of written history fits inside about 5,000 years. Every king, every empire, every single book anyone has ever written about it. This one habit, this single recipe for red paint, outlasted every version of civilization we know of several times over. Ancient Egypt with its pyramids and its pharaohs lasted roughly 3,000 years before it finally faded. Rome, from its earliest villages to the fall of its last emperor, barely reached the same mark. Now imagine a single unbroken thread of knowledge passed quietly from hand to hand, outlasting Egypt and Rome, combined several times over with no palace behind it, no army, no written law. Just people teaching people who taught their own children who taught theirs. How does a habit survive that long? How does a technique get passed on generation after generation for 25,000 years without a single written word to carry it? Some researchers see this as proof of remarkably steady social learning. Children watching parents. Parents watching their own parents before them in an unbroken chain stretching back further than we can easily imagine. Others suspect something bigger was at play, that this recipe carried real weight tied to belief or identity strongly enough that people guarded it, protected it, refused to let it simply fade away. Maybe it survived through simple habit. Maybe it survived because it meant too much to lose. Or maybe most quietly of all, those were never separate things to begin with. Now step outside that cave for a moment and look at the wider world around her. The coastline near Blombos was and still is unusually rich. Cold currents rise up from the deep ocean carrying nutrients that feed thick beds of shellfish clinging to the rocks. At low tide, people here could walk out and gather mussels, whelks, and giant sea snails almost by the basketful. This single detail, a shoreline generous enough to feed people reliably, season after season, might be one of the most important and least appreciated facts in the entire story of our species. A short distance along that same stretch of coast sits another cave, this one near a small town called Mossel Bay. People sheltered inside it on and off for well over 100,000 years, and the layers inside tell a strikingly steady story. Season after season, generation after generation, people returned to the same rocks, gathered the same shellfish, and built an entire way of life around a coastline that simply refused to fail them, even while the interior of the continent dried into dust. Because around this same period, the wider world was not nearly so kind. Long stretches of Africa were caught in brutal grinding droughts. Some scientists estimate that during the harshest of these stretches, the total number of humans alive on the entire planet may have dropped to only a few thousand people. Not a few thousand in one country, a few thousand in total everywhere on Earth. It is strange to sit with that in a world now holding more than 8 billion of us. But there was a real window in our story when the survival of every single human being alive today may have depended on a narrow rocky strip of African coastline and the shellfish clinging patiently to its rocks. Was this exact shoreline part of that story? Did the very people who mixed this paint also belong to the small scattered groups who somehow carried our entire species through its hardest years? Did she ever look out at the ocean and sense without any words for it how much was quietly resting on this one narrow strip of rock, and if a handful of storms or one truly terrible season had gone even slightly differently? Would any of us be sitting here tonight to ask the question at all? Here is what feels worth sitting with before we move forward together. That same instinct, the urge to take something raw from the earth and turn it into colour, into meaning, into care over how you present yourself to the world, never actually left us. It is still folded somewhere into your bones tonight. Every time you reach for a colour that feels like you, every time you take a little extra care with how you show up in the world, you are echoing something that began in a cave very much like this one 100,000 years ago. That is who we come from. Not blank grunting animals, but careful hands, patient minds, people capable of turning stone into colour and colour into meaning long before anyone thought to write a single word down. It is worth remembering too that she never once thought of herself as ancient. To her this was simply a normal afternoon, the ordinary unremarkable work of preparing something she needed. She had no way of knowing she was standing at the very beginning of a story that would eventually include you sitting somewhere warm and safe 100,000 years later, listening to a stranger's voice describe her hands in the dark. Think about that word for a moment. Refused, not helped, not simply supported, refused to fail them, because everywhere else on the continent during this exact stretch of time, the ground itself was turning against people. Rivers vanished. Grasslands cracked and blew away as dust, and entire groups of humans in places without a forgiving coastline to fall back on appear to have quietly disappeared from the record altogether, leaving no more trace than a single scattered layer of stone tools with no one left to use them. Which brings us to a harder, quieter question hiding underneath everything we've talked about tonight. If a coastline like this one is what kept a scattered handful of human beings alive through the hardest stretch our species has ever faced, then how narrowly did the whole idea of humanity come to disappearing completely before it ever really had the chance to begin? And yet, for all of that skill, for all of that quiet meaning, the very existence of people like her on that exact stretch of coastline was about to be tested in a way that had almost never happened before. Because somewhere beyond the mouth of that cave in a changing world she could not possibly see coming, the number of humans left alive on the whole of Earth was about to shrink to almost nothing. The danger gathering around her world did not look like a war or a monster or anything simple enough to point at and name. It looked like ordinary quiet. The kind of quiet that if you were not paying careful attention you might mistake for peace. Further along this same stretch of African coastline in the hazy light just after sunset, an older man stands on a rocky point looking out at a string of small fires flickering along the shore. He has stood in this exact spot every evening for as long as he can remember, counting them almost without meaning to. Tonight there are fewer than there were during his own childhood. The dry season has stretched on longer than usual this year, and the game trails further inland have gone strangely empty. 2 valleys over the fires that once burned every night through the cold season have not been lit in longer than he can count. He does not know the word extinction. He has no need for it. He can simply see with his own eyes that his world is growing quieter one fire at a time. Here is something remarkable. We do not know about this shrinking world mainly because of old bones or ancient campfires or tools left behind in the sand. We know about it because of something carried quietly inside every single person alive today, folded into every cell of your body. It helps to understand briefly why the whole continent was drying out at exactly this moment. Earth was sliding into one of the long, harsh phases of an ice age cycle, a stretch scientists refer to by a rather dry technical name, but which simply meant this. Huge amounts of the planet's water were locking away into thickening ice sheets far to the north, and that shift dragged rainfall patterns sideways across Africa with it. Lakes that had supported generations of families quietly shrank into cracked mud. Rivers that used to run through the dry months stopped running altogether. This was not a single bad year. It was something like 150 consecutive years of bad years repeating in slow grinding waves. Have you ever taken one of those home ancestry kits, spit into a little tube and waited weeks for a report tracing your background back through the centuries? If so, you have already brushed up against exactly the kind of science we're talking about tonight, just turned up to an almost unbelievable scale. Scientists studying that same kind of genetic code in people today notice something strange. Trace certain lines of inheritance, the ones passed only from mother to daughter, generation after generation backward through time, and every single line eventually arrives at the same meeting point. A shared ancestor somewhere around 145,000 years ago. This does not mean there was only one woman alive on Earth at that moment, some single, solitary figure wandering an empty planet. There were certainly other women alive around her, plenty of them. It means something quieter, and in some ways stranger. Of all the women alive at that time, only her particular line of daughters and granddaughters and great-granddaughters survived unbroken all the way down to you and to me, and to every single person watching this tonight. Every other mother's line eventually simply ran out. Interestingly, this is not the only version of the same story hiding in your body. There is a separate parallel piece of genetic code passed strictly from father to son that scientists have traced back the exact same way, and it points to a similar meeting point, a man whose particular line of sons managed to survive unbroken down to today, while every other father's line one by one quietly ended. The 2 dates, the one from the mothers and the one from the fathers, do not line up perfectly, and that mismatch alone tells researchers something useful. It suggests men and women were not experiencing this crisis in identical ways, perhaps because of differences in how far people travel to find partners, or how groups reorganize themselves whenever a smaller band lost too many of its own hunters or gatherers to keep functioning on its own. So how small did the overall group actually get? Even the experts do not fully agree. Some geneticists working through the mathematics of how much genetic variation exists in people today argue the breeding population, meaning the number of people actually having children and passing on their genetic code, may have dropped to only a few hundred individuals scattered across the continent. Others push back on that number, arguing it undercounts how spread out and disconnected different small groups likely were, and put the true figure more toward a few thousand. It is worth pausing on a common misunderstanding here. A number that's small can sound like a sign of weakness, as though our species barely scraped by out of sheer trembling luck. The truth sitting underneath the mathematics tells a different story. A population can shrink that far and still survive generation after generation, only if the people inside it are doing almost everything right, sharing food fairly during lean months, caring for the old, the injured, and the very young instead of leaving them behind, finding ways to keep meeting and mixing with neighbouring groups rather than curling inward, and slowly running out of new partners to marry. A number this small is not evidence of weakness. If anything, it is evidence of just how disciplined, cooperative, and quietly resilient these people had to be every single season for it to work at all. Maybe it truly was a few hundred. Maybe it was a few thousand thinly scattered across an entire continent. Or maybe, and this is the more unsettling possibility, the real number never sat still at all, drifting dangerously low in the worst years and climbing cautiously back up whenever the rains finally returned. If a number this small sounds almost too extreme to be believable, it helps to know we're not the only species with a story like this hiding in our genetic code. Cheetahs today, for instance, carry astonishingly little genetic variation between individuals, a pattern most researchers trace back to a similar ancient population crash of their own. Skin grafts between two completely unrelated cheetahs can succeed almost as easily as they would between identical twins, simply because the entire species passed through such a narrow genetic doorway at some point in its past. Giant pandas, northern elephant seals, and a handful of other well-studied animals carry similar scars buried in their own genetic code. Our own story, in other words, is not some strange, isolated exception to how life on this planet usually works. It may simply be an unusually well-documented example of something evolution puts nearly every surviving species through sooner or later. Here's where this story gets a personal face, and not from 100,000 generations ago this time, but from right now. An archaeologist named Curtis Marion spent the early part of his career studying human origins in East Africa, the region most textbooks still point to as the cradle of our species. Then sometime in the early 1990s, he came across this same unsettling genetic research. The shrinking family tree, the narrow, dangerous bottleneck, and it completely rearranged how he thought about his own work. If the human story nearly ended at some point, he began to wonder. Then the far more interesting question was not simply where we began, but where exactly we managed to hang on. He has since described that shift in thinking as one of those rare moments in a scientific career when an entire research question quietly rewrites itself overnight, and you spend the next 20 years simply following wherever the trail goes. That question eventually brought him to a cave along the very coastline we have been describing tonight, a site now known by its research name Pinnacle Point, tucked into the cliffs near the small town of Mossel Bay. People sheltered inside it on and off across an almost unbroken span of well over 100,000 years through what may have been the tightest, most dangerous population squeeze our species has ever faced. Marianne and his team did not simply walk in and find an obvious treasure sitting on the surface. They spent years digging down through layer after layer of compacted sand, sometimes only removing a few careful centimeters in an entire season, sifting every grain through fine mesh screens by hand, searching for shell fragments, burnt bone, and the tiny stone flakes left behind by someone shaping a tool. It is slow, patient, unglamorous work, the kind that rarely makes headlines on its own, and it took the better part of 2 decades before the full shape of the story came into focus. It was not luck alone. His research points to a very specific combination: shellfish clinging to the rocks and edible plant roots hidden in the sand nearby, together forming a food supply steady enough to survive on, even while the rest of the continent had turned dry and hostile. This is also where 2 threads of our story start to weave back together. The very same stretch of coastline that sheltered this shrinking population is, geologically speaking, only a short walk from the cave where we watched a woman carefully mixing red paint a little earlier tonight. It is entirely possible that her careful, deliberate paint making and this population's narrow escape from disappearing altogether were not 2 separate stories at all, but 2 small pieces of the exact same one. Some researchers now suspect that exactly this kind of pressure, small groups forced into tight, constant contact, leaning on each other for survival, year after difficult year, may have been the very spark that pushed early human minds toward more complex thinking, sharper communication, and the kind of careful, symbolic behavior we saw expressed in that cave. What does it actually take to save an entire species from disappearing? Is it toughness? Is it sheer luck? Or is it something far less dramatic, something as unglamorous as knowing exactly which rocks to check at low tide year after year without fail? Marianne's own theory suggests this particular stretch of coastline may have been the single most important refuge, the place more than any other that kept our species going. Other researchers are more cautious. They argue survival likely happened in several separate pockets scattered across the continent at once, this coastline being one important refuge among a handful, rather than the only place that mattered. Maybe this exact shoreline saved us almost single-handedly. Maybe it was simply one of several quiet refuges, each holding its own small corner of the continent together. Or maybe, most honestly of all, we will never fully untangle which of these scattered fires were the ones that truly mattered, and which quietly went dark without anyone ever knowing they had been there at all. Try imagining for a moment what daily life actually felt like inside a population this small. A group numbering only in the dozens, perhaps settled within walking distance of 1 or 2 other groups of similar size, and almost nobody else for hundreds of miles in any direction. Under those conditions, meeting people outside your own small band was not some pleasant social nicety. It was more like a biological necessity. Marrying only within your own tiny group generation after generation tends to concentrate rare, harmful traits until they start doing real damage. So these scattered bands most likely maintained wide, deliberate social webs, trading partners, sharing news and exchanging sons and daughters in marriage across considerable distances precisely to keep their own bloodlines healthy enough to continue. In a strange way, loneliness itself may have been one of the greatest dangers this population faced, right alongside drought and hunger. There is something worth sitting with here, something a little larger than any single number. But this was not in the end a story that stayed frozen at its lowest point forever. Slowly, unevenly, and without any single dramatic turning point that anyone at the time could have pointed to, the rains eventually softened. Rivers further inland began running again for longer stretches each year, and the small scattered bands who had spent so long clinging to a handful of reliable coastlines began cautiously to spread back out across the wider continent. Numbers crept upward, new bands formed, old empty valleys slowly filled again with the sound of distant fires being lit at dusk. It is tempting to imagine this as the end of the danger, a hard chapter finally finished for good. It was not. Every person alive today, every single face you will ever meet, is a direct unbroken descendant of a group that came dangerously near to disappearing completely. not gradually across some comfortable stretch of centuries, but through the razor-thin filter of a genuine population crisis. You're not simply fortunate to exist. You're the end result of thousands of consecutive years in which almost nothing was allowed to go too badly wrong. Think about everyone you have ever loved. Every friend, every family member, every stranger who has ever made you laugh without meaning to. Every one of them shares this same razor-thin thread running back through time. We rarely think of strangers as relatives, yet in the most literal biological sense, that is exactly what we all are: cousins. Many thousands of times removed, all descended from the same small, stubborn handful of survivors. So the next time your day feels a little chaotic, you might take some quiet comfort in this. Your ancestors survived odds far worse than a missed alarm or a rough commute, and they did it without a single convenience you would recognize as normal. If you've ever had your own ancestry tested and traced a line backward through the centuries, does it feel any different now? Knowing how narrowly that entire chain once came to snapping completely, I would honestly love to hear your thoughts on that. And here is the uncomfortable part. This narrow, fragile population squeeze may not have been the worst threat this small, struggling group of survivors was about to face. The coastline had held. The rains eventually had returned. Families had rebuilt what drought had quietly taken from them one careful season at a time. But comfort in this particular story never seems to last very long. Somewhere out beyond the edge of that same coastline, hidden inside a mountain, most of these people had never even seen or heard of. Something else was quietly building toward a moment that would test them again on a scale almost too large to properly imagine, one that had nothing at all to do with rainfall or rivers or any drought anyone had ever endured before. Somewhere across a wide river valley in what is now northern India, the sky did something that had never happened before in memory, reaching back further than anyone there could count. It began quietly. A thin grey haze settling over the hills at midday, dimming the sun until it looked almost safe to stare at directly. A woman grinding grain outside her shelter paused, brushed something pale and powdery off her forearm and looked up expecting rain. Then came the ash, fine, pale and endless, drifting down like the quietest snowfall imaginable, settling on shoulders, on cooking fires, on the surface of the river itself until the water ran the colour of chalk. Birds went silent. Somewhere nearby a dog paced in restless circles, unsettled by something none of the people around it could name. There was no storm, no thunder, no fire anywhere on the horizon to explain it. Just a sky that would not stop falling, for what the people enduring it must have felt was an impossibly long time. They had no way of knowing that thousands of miles away on an island most of them would never once hear of in their entire time on Earth, a mountain had torn itself apart. We know it today as the Toba eruption, and it remains, as far as scientists have been able to measure, the single largest volcanic event of the last 28 million years. It happened on the island of Sumatra roughly 74,000 years ago, and it did not simply erupt so much as detonate, throwing an almost unthinkable volume of rock ash and gas into the sky, enough material by some estimates to bury the island of Manhattan under a layer more than a mile deep. For comparison, the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980, an event that reshaped an entire mountain and was visible from space, produced roughly 1,000th of the material Toba threw skyward in a single sustained blast. What remains of the volcano today is not a mountain at all, but a lake. Lake Toba now stretches roughly 60 miles long, a vast, quiet body of water sitting inside the scar left behind by that single, catastrophic afternoon, deep enough in places to comfortably hide a fair-sized mountain beneath its surface, and calm enough today that visitors paddle across it in small wooden boats without ever suspecting what once happened there. For a long time, the story scientists told about this event was almost unbearably grim. In the later 1990s, an anthropologist named Stanley Ambrose proposed what became known as the Toba catastrophe theory. His argument went something like this. The eruption threw so much ash and sulfur into the upper atmosphere that it blocked out sunlight across much of the planet, triggering a volcanic winter that may have lasted 6 to 10 years, followed by a much longer cooling stretch that dragged on for roughly 1,000 years afterward. The mechanism itself is fairly simple physics. Sulfur particles, once high enough in the atmosphere, reflect sunlight back into space before it ever reaches the ground, and a cloud that thick spread that wide can chip whole degrees off the average global temperature for years at a stretch. Crops of wild plants failed, animal herds collapsed, and Ambrose connected all of this directly to the same shrinking family tree we spent time with a little earlier tonight, arguing this single eruption was the trigger behind it, the reason our species' numbers had once fallen so dangerously low. In his version of events, the human population crashed down to somewhere under 10,000 individuals, scattered across the entire globe, teetering right at the edge of complete extinction. It is a truly terrifying image. Our entire species reduced to a number smaller than the crowd at a high school football game, huddled somewhere in the ashes of a dying world. Here is the part that should stop you for a moment. The very people we just described standing in that river valley in India, watching ash fall from a clear sky, were sitting almost directly inside the worst of it. If the old theory was true, this should have been one of the deadliest places on Earth to be alive that year. So what actually happened to them? Archaeologists digging through that same valley at a site now known as Dabba found something nobody fully expected. The excavation there eventually exposed an extraordinary stretch of stacked sediment layer sitting on layer, representing something nearing 80,000 years of more or less continuous history at a single location. Underneath, within, and directly above the layer of ash, from that eruption, they uncovered stone tools. Not a scattering of leftover pieces from a population already collapsing, but a long continuous unbroken record of people shaping and using tools, before the ash fell during the years the ash was settling, and long after the sky finally cleared again. The style of tool making does not vanish. It does not change dramatically. It simply continues layer after layer, small cutting flakes and scrapers, appearing in roughly the same forms above the ash as they do below it, as though the people responsible for it had weathered something frightening, and then quite simply carried on with their days. Some researchers still hold on to pieces of the original catastrophe theory, arguing that even if this particular valley escaped the worst of it, other regions nearer to the volcano or less fortunate in their local food supply may have suffered exactly the kind of collapse Ambrose originally described. Others go much further, suggesting the entire apocalyptic version of this story was built on assumptions that simply do not hold up once you start digging in the right places. A researcher named Chad Yost, working through the archaeological and environmental evidence years later, published a detailed argument concluding that the eruption, as dramatic and violent as it clearly was, likely did not push our species anywhere near the edge of extinction after all. There is a strange, almost uncomfortable twist buried inside this story too. The very ash that blotted out the sun and coated the river in grey powder was not purely destructive. Volcanic ash, once it finally settles and begins breaking down into the soil beneath it, is often rich in minerals that plants depend on to grow. Some of the very same regions that endured the worst of that terrifying grey sky may have found themselves years later standing on some of the most fertile ground for hundreds of miles around. Disaster and renewal folded into the exact same layer of earth. Maybe the worst version of this disaster happened somewhere else in a place we simply have not excavated yet. Maybe the catastrophe theory was from the very beginning built on far less solid ground than it first appeared. Or maybe, and this feels like the most honest answer of all human beings, are simply far better at quietly enduring a nightmare than any of us tend to give our ancestors credit for. How do scientists even know with any real confidence that this particular layer of ash came from this particular volcano on this particular day 74,000 years ago? It is a fair question, and the answer involves a strange kind of forensic science that has very little to do with digging up bones or counting rings inside a tree. Volcanic ash carries tiny, near-invisible shards of glass formed the instant molten rock meets open air and cools almost instantly. Every volcano produces glass with its own distinct chemical signature, something like a fingerprint left behind in stone, shaped by the exact mineral recipe of the magma that produced it. Researchers extract these microscopic shards from the sediment, examine their chemical makeup under specialized equipment, and match that signature against known samples from the Toba eruption itself. When the fingerprint matches precisely across sites separated by thousands of miles, there is very little room left for coincidence. That same fingerprint remarkably has been found tucked inside sediment layers along the African coastline as well, thousands of miles from Sumatra, in the opposite direction, the very same general stretch of coast we spent time exploring earlier tonight. Researchers there found the ash sitting quietly inside layers packed with evidence of ordinary continuous daily life tools, being made fires, being tended, shellfish being gathered, showing no dramatic break, no abandoned settlement, no sign whatsoever of a population in the process of collapsing. Two sites separated by an entire ocean, and thousands of miles of open land telling remarkably similar stories about the same single afternoon. Picture the actual reach of this thing for a moment. From the crater in Sumatra to that coastline in southern Africa is a distance of roughly 5,000 miles further than flying from New York to Tokyo. And somewhere in the middle of that vast distance sits the valley in India where we began this story tonight. One single eruption, its fingerprint scattered across 3 separate continents worth of ancient ground, and in every place scientists have thought to look closely, the same quiet, stubborn evidence of people simply continuing on. There is also a second piece of the original catastrophe theory worth examining honestly. Ice cores drilled from deep inside Greenland and Antarctica preserve a kind of yearly diary of the planet's temperature locked into layers of ancient snow and trapped air bubbles. When researchers went looking for the dramatic 1,000-year deep freeze, Ambrose originally proposed the ice itself told a more modest story. Some cooling clearly happened, but several ice core studies suggest it was considerably milder and considerably shorter than the original volcanic winter model, called for more a difficult handful of years than a full millennium locked in crisis. Maybe the cooling was as severe as first proposed in certain regions the ice cores simply have not captured in enough detail yet. Maybe it was real, but far milder and shorter than the original theory needed it to be. Or maybe most likely of all, the truth varied enormously depending on exactly where on the planet you happened to be standing that year. Brutal in some places, barely noticeable in others. It is worth asking honestly why the far more frightening version of this story spread so much further than the corrected one ever did. Some of that comes down to simple timing. Ambrose published his original theory decades before archaeologists had excavated a site like Daba in enough detail to challenge it. So the catastrophic version had a considerable head start working its way into documentaries, textbooks, and casual conversation long before anyone had the evidence to properly push back. And there is something else at work too, something almost embarrassingly human. A story about a volcano nearly wiping out our entire species is simply more dramatic, more shareable, more satisfying to repeat at a dinner party than a quieter, more accurate story about people calmly adapting to a terrible year and then carrying on with their days. It is not so different if you think about it from how information still spreads today. A dramatic claim gets shared 1,000 times over before the careful patient correction ever catches up to it, and by then the original version has already settled comfortably into what everyone simply assumes to be true. Toba may be one of the oldest examples of this pattern that we can actually measure sitting in stone and ash instead of comment sections, but the underlying shape of it feels remarkably familiar. Have you ever noticed how the frightening version of a story always seems to travel faster and further than the boring, complicated truth? This might be one of the oldest examples of that pattern we have on record, written not in headlines but in volcanic glass and stone tools. Think for a moment about what it must have actually taken to endure something like this without the comfort of ever understanding what was happening. No news of a distant island. No scientific explanation for a sky that would not stop falling. Just days, then weeks of grey light and dying plants, and a decision made over and over to keep gathering whatever food could still be found to keep the fire going, to keep teaching children how to survive a world that had briefly, terrifyingly stopped behaving the way it was supposed to. There is something worth carrying with you from this part of the story, something beyond the volcano itself. We tend to imagine resilience as a single dramatic act, standing firm against one enormous threat once and being done with it. The people in that river valley remind us that real resilience usually looks far quieter than that. It looks like waking up the next morning under an ash-coloured sky and doing exactly what needs to be done anyway, without any promise that things will improve, and without any way of knowing whether anyone tens of thousands of years later would ever learn their names or notice what they had survived at all. Has there ever been a stretch of your own life that felt a little like that grey, uncertain sky? A period with no clear explanation, no timeline for when it would lift, where the only real option left was simply to keep going. One ordinary task at a time, I find it strangely comforting to think that this particular kind of endurance is not a modern invention at all. It is something stitched directly into what it has always meant to be human. And if it helps put your own worst weeks into perspective, consider this. Whatever difficult stretch you are currently pushing through, it almost certainly does not involve the actual sky refusing to stop falling for weeks on end. What strikes me most sitting with this story is how ordinary the actual survival looked from the inside. No hero. No single brilliant decision that saved everyone. Just thousands of small, forgettable choices repeated by ordinary people day after grey day, until the ash finally stopped and the world slowly remembered how to be a world again. History rarely rewards us with a clean dramatic turning point. More often it simply rewards persistence, quiet and unglamorous, one grey morning at a time. And they were not finished being tested yet. Because even as the ash finally settled and the sky slowly cleared back to something resembling normal, something else quieter and far stranger than any volcano was beginning to stir in the minds of the very people who had just endured it. A shift that had nothing to do with survival at all, and everything to do with what they would eventually choose to do with it. Not every important moment in this story involves fire or food or survival. Some of the most important moments happened in complete stillness in the space between two hands and a piece of stone. Back inside that same cave on the southern tip of Africa, a little later than the woman we met earlier tonight, a young man sits near the entrance with a flat reddish flake of stone balanced across his knee. Outside, the tide is out and somewhere further down the beach voices carry faintly on the air. Other members of his group gathering shellfish before the water turns. He is not with them. In one hand he holds a small worn stub of ochre, sharpened almost to a point through repeated use. He presses it against the stone and begins slowly to draw, not randomly, not the aimless scratching of someone bored waiting for the rain to pass. Line after line angled the same careful way, crossing each other at almost exactly the same width, apart every time. He pauses. He turns the stone slightly, checking the pattern against the light. Then he continues unhurried, as though the lines themselves already know exactly where they are supposed to go. What he is holding, whether he could ever have imagined it or not, is now considered the oldest known drawing ever made by a human hand. Researchers dated this particular flake to roughly 73,000 years old, discovered in the same cave Blombos where we spent time earlier tonight. It shows a careful, deliberate crosshatch pattern, a grid of thin red lines crossing at consistent angles made with what functions essentially as an ochre pencil. Not a smear, not an accident. A drawing in the fullest sense of that word, tens of thousands of years before anyone would think to put a mark like it on papyrus clay or paper. You might reasonably wonder how anyone could possibly tell the difference between a deliberate drawing and a piece of stone that simply happened to get scratched while someone was using it for something else entirely. Grinding a seed, sharpening a tool, or scraping hide. It turns out the difference shows up clearly once you look closely enough. Under magnification, the lines sit at a consistent depth, a consistent pressure, and a consistent angle relative to one another, the unmistakable signature of a single hand making a series of controlled connected strokes, rather than the random uneven scuffing that ordinary wear and damage tends to leave behind. Whoever made these lines was not working. They were making something on purpose for reasons of their own. Here is where the story most people carry around in their heads tends to fall apart completely. Most of us imagine that drawing, writing, and symbolic thinking arrived as one dramatic package somewhere alongside farming and cities and kings. But this single flake of stone was made roughly 68,000 years before the very first city would ever be built anywhere on Earth. The habit of putting deliberate marks onto a surface on purpose to represent something beyond the mark itself did not begin with civilization at all. It came first, long, long before. And this was not an isolated flash of inspiration either. A researcher named Francesco De Rico, working alongside the same team that first excavated this cave, has spent years studying a much larger collection of engraved ochre pieces recovered from the same layers of sand. Out of many thousands of ochre fragments pulled from that single cave floor, a small, careful set, somewhere around 12 in total, carry this exact same kind of intentional marking. Most bearing some version of the same crosshatch design, a grid of parallel lines bordered by straight edges along the top, and bottom repeated again and again across pieces separated by thousands of years of sediment. One particularly striking example, smoothed flat first and then carefully etched, resembles something nearer to a woven lattice, or if you squint at it the way a modern viewer might, something not entirely unlike a hashtag pressed into stone tens of thousands of years before anyone had a reason to invent one. Is this writing? Is this art? Or is it something else? Entirely. Something we do not really have a proper word for because nothing quite like it exists in our own experience. The debate among researchers who study this kind of evidence is far from settled. Some argue this pattern absolutely required language to survive as a tradition. A design this specific repeated this precisely across so many separate hands, and so many years could not simply spread by watching alone. Somebody at some point had to explain it. Had to say in words we will never hear, "This is how the lines go, and this is why they matter." Others are more cautious. They point out that humans and plenty of other animals too can pick up and repeat fairly complex motor patterns, purely through observation. No spoken explanation required, the same way a skilled craftsperson today can teach an apprentice to carve a specific pattern into wood through demonstration alone, without ever needing to put the technique into words. A child learning to fold a paper crane by simply watching a grandparent's hands over and over rarely needs a single sentence of instruction either, and yet the finished shape comes out recognizably, reliably correct. Maybe this pattern proves full spoken language already existed. Maybe it only proves that watching, copying, and practicing are powerful teachers all on their own. Or maybe, and this feels like the quietest and most honest possibility, the line between those two explanations was never as solid as we would like it to be. There is a third possibility worth mentioning too, one some researchers find just as compelling as the other two. A handful of scholars studying these patterns have wondered whether the careful, countable repetition of lines might represent something akin to an early form of tallying, a way of tracking days or seasons, or perhaps something being counted that we have no way of identifying anymore. It is an idea that remains firmly unproven, resting more on careful speculation than solid evidence. but it points to something worth sitting with regardless. Whatever this pattern meant to the person who made it, the fact that serious researchers can even entertain the idea of ancient counting, hiding inside these lines tells you just how far this evidence has already pushed the boundaries of what we once assumed people were capable of this deep into the past. There is also something quietly remarkable buried inside the act of teaching itself, easy to walk right past if you're not looking for it. To pass a pattern like this from one person to another, the teacher first has to understand something subtle, that the person sitting across from them does not already know what they know, that knowledge has to be deliberately placed into another mind rather than simply assumed to already be there. This sounds almost too obvious to mention, until you remember that this kind of awareness, sometimes called a theory of mind, is considered one of the more sophisticated tricks the human brain can perform. A cross-hatched line on a piece of ochre may look simple. The mental machinery required to teach it to someone else on purpose is anything but. Let's travel a little further along this same coastline and a good deal further forward in time to a rock shelter called Deep Kloof. Here archaeologists uncovered something almost stranger than the engraved stone itself, hundreds of fragments of ostrich eggshell, each one originally part of a container people used to carry and store water across the dry season. An ostrich egg holds nearly a full litre of liquid inside a shell, tough enough to survive being carried on foot for miles over rough, uneven ground, which made it in practical terms one of the most valuable pieces of equipment a person in this landscape could own. And carved across many of these fragments the same kind of deliberate geometric pattern, bands of parallel lines, hatched sections, careful and repeated, cut into the shell itself with a small, sharp stone point. What makes Deep Kloof remarkable is not simply that the pattern exists, it is that the pattern changes in an organised way over time. Researchers studying more than 400 engraved fragments recovered from the site were able to sort them by which layer of sediment they came from, tracing a span of use stretching across several thousand years, and a clear pattern emerged. Earlier eggshell containers carry one particular style of engraving. Move up through the layers of sediment forward through the centuries, and the preferred style shifts replaced by a different but equally deliberate pattern, which then holds steady for a long stretch, before shifting again, almost like flipping slowly through the pages of a very old, very patient catalogue. Think about what an object like this would have meant to the person carrying it. In a landscape without street signs, without name tags, without any of the small daily markers we use constantly and barely even notice, a container engraved with your group's particular pattern was in a very real sense an identity. Anyone glancing at it from across a clearing would know immediately who it belonged to and which group of people were nearby. Have you ever doodled the exact same little symbol in the corner of your notebooks for years, almost without noticing you were doing it some private little mark that was simply unmistakably yours? There is a real chance you're echoing an instinct considerably older than any of us tend to give it credit for. So why would a pattern on a water container change gradually, generation after generation? Some researchers argue this reflects shifting group identity, different bands adopting their own version of the design, the way a family today might adjust a recipe slightly with each new generation, similar enough to the original to be recognized, different enough to be their own. Others suggest something nearer to fashion a preferred style, simply drifting over time the way clothing or hairstyles quietly shift across decades, without any single dramatic cause behind the change at all. Maybe it was identity carefully guarded and passed down. Maybe it was something nearer to fashion drifting on its own, without any single fixed meaning attached to it at all. Or maybe, and this might be the most human explanation of the three, it was both those things at once. The way most of what we choose to wear or carry or mark ourselves with still tends to be today. There is something worth sitting with here. Something that connects a stone flake in one cave to a fragment of eggshell in another, separated by thousands of years and dozens of miles of coastline. Somewhere in this stretch of time, the human mind quietly crossed a threshold it would never cross back over again. Marks on a surface stopped being accidents and started being messages. Not necessarily full sentences, not necessarily anything we would recognize as writing in the way we use that word today, but something new all the same, a bridge between one mind and another built entirely out of intention. Once that bridge exists, once it is possible to plant an idea inside someone else's head using nothing but a shared symbol, both people already understand the whole nature of what a group of people can accomplish together quietly changes. Knowledge no longer has to be relearned by every single person alone through pure trial and error. It can simply be handed over, refined and handed over again each generation, starting a small but real step ahead of the last one. It's worth remembering too that none of this required anyone to be extraordinary. The young man with the stone flake was not a genius set apart from everyone around him. He was almost certainly doing something his own family had shown him, something he would go on to show someone else. In turn, an ordinary skill passed quietly from hand to hand, the same way your own grandmother might have taught you a particular stitch, or your father might have taught you exactly how he liked his coffee prepared. History likes to hand us the names of singular geniuses. This part of our story belongs instead to countless anonymous ordinary people, none of whom ever thought of themselves as remarkable, quietly building something that would outlast every one of their names. That instinct, the pull to leave a deliberate mark behind to say in whatever small way available I was here and this meant something to me, never really left us. It survives in a signature at the bottom of a letter. It survives in initials carved into a park bench or a child's handprint pressed into wet concrete outside a new house. It survives every single time you doodle in the margin of a page while your mind wanders somewhere else entirely. Do you have a habit like that yourself? A particular way you sign your name, a small drawing you find your hand returning to, without ever quite deciding to a pattern? You doodled through an entire year of school notebooks without a single person ever asking you to explain it. I would be curious to know what yours looks like, and how long you've been making it without ever really noticing. There is a particular kind of quiet pride worth allowing yourself here, sitting on your side of thousands and thousands of years. Every time a message reaches you today, a text, a letter, a name carved into a wedding ring, you're carrying forward the direct, unbroken continuation of something that began with people who had no word for writing, no word for art, and quite possibly no full sense yet of what they were actually starting. They simply picked up a stone and a piece of coloured earth and reached toward each other across a silence that had lasted for the entire existence of every creature that came before them. And once a mind is capable of that kind of thinking, once an idea can travel from one person's hands into another person's hands without a single word needing to be spoken, that mind is ready for something far bigger than a cave or a coastline or a single stretch of shore that had kept an entire species alive for so long. It is ready to wonder what lies beyond the edge of the only home it has ever known. And soon enough, driven by hunger, curiosity, or simple restlessness, we will likely never fully untangle. Some of these same minds would begin walking further than anyone in their family line had ever walked before, out toward a horizon none of them could yet see. Here is something almost nobody expects the first time they hear it. Leaving Africa was not something our species managed to do once cleanly, and then simply carried on from there. We tried and failed more than once before it finally worked. Picture a small band moving north out of the African interior following a river valley that at this particular moment in history looked nothing like the harsh desert most of us picture today. The land around them is green. Grasses ripple across what would one day become the driest, most unforgiving stretch of sand on the entire planet. Herds of grazing animals move alongside them, drawn to the same seasonal water, and somewhere behind the group a young hunter pauses to watch a herd of gazelle pick their way across ground that has no business supporting anything green at all, at least not in the world he will eventually grow old in. Somewhere ahead, past a narrow strip of land connecting two continents, lies a world none of their ancestors had ever set foot in. This was not a single tidy departure. It happened in waves separated by tens of thousands of years, and most of those waves quietly failed. The very first hint we have of this comes from an unlikely place, a cave on the coast of Greece where researchers recovered a fragment of skull dated to somewhere beyond 200,000 years old. It remains, as far as anyone has confirmed, the oldest evidence of a member of our own species ever found outside of Africa, and that is almost the entire story. A single fragment wedged into a cave wall for so long that the team who found it originally assumed it belonged to a Neanderthal, only to have careful reanalysis years later reveal the rounded shape at the back of the skull that marks it instead as one of our own. No tools scattered nearby, no sign of a lasting settlement. Whoever this person was, their group appears to have vanished from the record almost as quickly as they arrived, swallowed back into deep time, without leaving behind so much as a second clue. None of these journeys happened on a whim, and none of them happened by accident either. Earth's orbit wobbles very slightly over long stretches of time, shifting exactly where seasonal rains fall across Africa and the Middle East. During certain stretches of that cycle, rain belts that normally stay further south crept northward instead, and the region we now call the Sahara Desert briefly transformed into something nearer to open grassland dotted with lakes, rivers, and enough vegetation to support herds of large animals migrating freely across it. These green corridors, as researchers sometimes call them, opened and shut like a slow patient door, sometimes staying open for a few thousand years before swinging shut again as the rain belts drifted back south. Each time that door opened, at least a few small bands of people appear to have walked straight through it, following the herds, the water, and the easier ground. A second attempt, considerably better documented, shows up roughly 100,000 years ago, a little further south in caves along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean in what is now Israel. Here, archaeologists have found something far more substantial than a single bone fragment. Multiple individuals deliberately buried, surrounded by the ordinary tools and habits of daily life. One burial included a set of deer antlers, placed carefully across the chest of the person laid to rest, a small, deliberate gesture that still, even across 100,000 years, reads unmistakably as an act of care rather than simple disposal. For a while it must have looked like these people had truly made it, a foothold outside the continent that had shaped every single one of their ancestors before them, and then quietly the trail goes cold again. You might wonder how researchers can put a number as specific as 100,000 years on bones this old in the first place. One of the more reliable methods involves the teeth themselves. Buried in the ground, tooth enamel slowly absorbs tiny amounts of natural background radiation from the surrounding soil over time, at a rate that can be measured today with specialized equipment. Compare the amount of accumulated radiation trapped inside an ancient tooth against the radiation levels present in the surrounding sediment, and researchers can calculate with real confidence roughly how long that tooth has been sitting in the ground. It is a strange kind of hourglass, buried and unnoticed for 100,000 years, quietly ticking away inside someone's jaw. Layers above these same caves, dated tens of thousands of years later, do not belong to our species at all. They belong to Neanderthals. Whatever community had settled here first, no matter how many generations they managed to raise in this new land, they did not remain the ones present there. Something replaced them, or absorbed them, or simply outlasted them long before any of their genetic legacy could make its way down to anyone alive today. So what actually happened to them? Did the climate turn against them? The same green corridor that had welcomed them in, swinging back toward desert and cutting off their retreat? Were they slowly pushed out or quietly folded into the Neanderthal groups already settled in the region? Or did something far simpler and far sadder happen? A population too small, too isolated, running out of luck. the way small isolated populations so often do. Some researchers lean toward climate as the deciding factor, pointing out that the region cycled repeatedly between lush welcoming grassland and punishing desert, as Earth's orbit shifted the rains northward and then pulled them back again over and over on a schedule measured in tens of thousands of years. Others suspect competition played the larger role this early small foothold, simply outmatched by Neanderthal groups who had spent hundreds of thousands of years perfecting exactly how to survive that particular landscape, its winters, its animals, its terrain. Maybe the climate turned first and shut the door behind them. Maybe the competition was simply too steep for a small unfamiliar population to survive for long. Or maybe most quietly of all, it did not take a single dramatic cause at all, just an accumulation of small ordinary misfortunes repeated across enough difficult years to finish the job. It would take tens of thousands of years and at least one more attempt before any version of this journey finally stuck. In between, life simply continued quietly along the African coastline generation, folding into generation waiting without any way of knowing it was waiting for conditions to align just once more. That third and final wave began somewhere around 70 to 60,000 years ago, and this time the route ran through a different door entirely. A narrow southern gap where the Horn of Africa nearly touches the Arabian Peninsula, a stretch of water known today as the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. During the depths of an ice age, with so much of the planet's water locked into glaciers, far to the north sea levels dropped low enough to shrink this crossing. Down to a distance a determined group on foot and by simple raft could plausibly manage. Imagine standing at the edge of that water for the first time, watching the far shore sit near enough to see, but with no certainty at all about what waited on solid ground, or whether the currents pulling at your simple craft would carry you there safely, or somewhere else entirely. This time it worked. Every person alive today whose ancestry traces outside the African continent descends in some meaningful sense from the people who made a crossing very much like this one. It is worth pausing on exactly who these people were before they ever reached that shoreline. This was not some separate hardier branch of our species bred for endurance in ways the earlier failed groups were not. Genetic evidence suggests this successful wave came from the very same small resilient population we spent time with earlier tonight, the descendants of the coastal survivors who had clung to a narrow strip of African shoreline through the worst population crisis our species has ever faced. In a very real sense, the group that finally succeeded in leaving Africa were the direct children and grandchildren of the group that had barely managed to survive staying in it. There is a curious kind of fingerprint left behind by exactly this sort of event one geneticists rely on constantly. Populations descended from a small founding group, the kind that might cross a narrow strait in a handful of boats, tend to carry noticeably less genetic variation than the larger population they originally split away from. And that is precisely the pattern researchers find today. People whose ancestry traces back to this exodus across Europe, Asia, the Americas and Australia combined carry measurably less genetic diversity among themselves than the people whose ancestry remained within Africa the entire time. It is a quiet, invisible echo of a crossing none of us witness still legible today in the genetic code of nearly everyone reading or rather listening to this sentence. Have you ever wondered even briefly what it must have taken to keep walking toward a horizon with absolutely no idea what waited on the other side, no map, no account from anyone who had gone before and returned to describe it? I think about that more than I probably should. It is one thing to move because home has become unbearable. It is another thing entirely to move toward a complete blank, trusting that whatever lies past the edge of the known world is worth more than the risk of finding out. Researchers studying this particular wave describe something that sounds almost like a slow patient hugging. Of the coastline, small groups moving along the shore rather than striking boldly inland drawn by the reliable food, a coast can offer shellfish-stranded fish birds nesting among the rocks. The the same kind of dependable resource that had already saved this species once before, along a very different coastline we spent time with earlier tonight. Moving this way, a family group covering only a handful of miles in a good year could still, across enough uninterrupted generations, cover an almost unimaginable stretch of the ancient world, edging along the southern coast of Arabia, then the coastline of what is now Iran and Pakistan, then further still following the shoreline like a thread being slowly, patiently pulled around the rim of an entire continent. Some researchers argue this single coastal route explains almost the entire spread of our species across Asia and beyond. A fast continuous corridor followed within a few thousand years, all the way to the far side of the world, a pace that stretched out across so many centuries would have felt to any single family like nothing more than settling a little further along the same familiar shoreline their parents had known. Others believed the truth was messier, several smaller groups fanning out along different paths at slightly different times, some hugging the coast, others venturing inland behind them once the first route had proven survivable. Maybe one determined coastal wave really did carry humanity almost the entire way around the world. Maybe it took several separate overlapping waves arriving at different times through different doors, or maybe, and this feels closest to the truth we can currently support it, was both an early coastal pulse opening the route with slower, messier waves filling in behind it over the centuries that followed. There is something worth sitting with here, something a little larger than migration maps and straight crossings. The version of this story we tend to receive in a single sentence in a textbook makes it sound inevitable, almost destined, as though humanity was always going to spread across the entire globe eventually one way or another. The actual evidence tells a far more fragile story. 2 earlier attempts came before this one, and both of them ended in silence. If that final crossing at Bab el-Mandeb had gone even slightly differently, a storm at the wrong moment, a season of unusually high water, a group simply choosing to turn back rather than risk the water at all, there is a real chance our entire species would still be confined to a single continent today, and none of us watching this would exist in anything like our current form. You are not simply descended from people who are brave. You are descended quite specifically from the group that happened to try, at exactly the right moment when the water was low enough, the timing was right enough, and nobody in that particular band decided the risk was not worth taking. It is worth remembering too that the people who succeeded were not smarter or stronger, or more advanced than the ones who came before them and quietly disappeared in those caves by the Mediterranean. They carried the same bodies, the same fears, very likely the same doubts, standing at the edge of unfamiliar water. The difference, as far as anyone can tell, came down mostly to timing, geography, and an uncomfortable amount of simple luck. There is something almost comforting in that if you sit with it for a moment. Success, even success, this enormous, this species-defining, does not always belong to whoever tried hardest. Sometimes it belongs to whoever happened to be standing at the right door when it finally briefly opened. Think about a decision you have made in your own life that felt small at the time, barely worth a second thought, and only later turned out to matter far more than you ever expected. I suspect most of us have at least one moment like that tucked away somewhere. It is strange and a little humbling to think that the single largest decision in the entire history of our species may have felt exactly that ordinary to the people actually experiencing it. Just another difficult morning, another stretch of water to cross, because the alternative, turning back toward a shrinking, uncertain home, felt worse. And once that door was open, once people had finally crossed into a world entirely new to them, they did not simply keep walking in one single direction. Within what amounts to the blink of an eye in evolutionary terms, they began spreading outward in every direction available to them into landscapes colder, stranger and more unfamiliar than anything their ancestors had ever needed to survive. And in some of those landscapes they were about to discover they were not entirely alone. They were not alone. That single fact would reshape everything that came after it, and almost nobody making that discovery had any real sense of what it would eventually mean. Somewhere in the hill country east of the Mediterranean, a small band of travellers, part of that same wave we followed a little earlier tonight, moves cautiously along a narrow game trail. The man in front stops. A head pressed into the mud beside a stream sits a footprint, broader than his own, heavier, the stride longer than anything in his own group could account for. He crouches, studies it for a long moment, running a finger along the edge where the mud has already begun to firm up at the edges, trying to guess how much time has passed since it was made. Somewhere out there, something built along familiar lines, and yet not quite familiar at all, is sharing this same valley with them. He says nothing to the others yet. He simply notices and keeps walking a little more carefully than before. We now know with a level of certainty that would have seemed like fantasy only 20 years ago exactly what he had stumbled onto. Neanderthals had already been present across Europe and parts of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years by the time modern humans ever set foot outside Africa. Thick-browed, powerfully built, superbly adapted to cold, difficult terrain, they were not a lesser version of us. They were their own success story, one that had already outlasted several ice ages before we ever arrived on the scene. For most of the last century, the assumption among scientists was simple, almost brutally so. Modern humans arrived, and modern humans won, sweeping aside a slower, dimmer cousin through simple superiority. It made for a tidy story. It also turns out to be mostly wrong. The physical evidence alone should have raised more questions sooner than it did. Neanderthal brains on average measured slightly larger than our own, though size alone tells you little about how a brain actually works. They controlled fire with confidence, crafted specialized tools for particular tasks, hunted large, dangerous animals cooperatively, and based on burials uncovered at several sites, appear to have deliberately buried at least some of their dead occasionally alongside objects that served no obvious practical purpose at all. None of that fits comfortably inside the old caricature of a shuffling, grunting brute, incapable of anything beyond raw survival. Here is the reversal that changed everything. Sequencing completed on ancient genetic material recovered from fossil remains revealed something nobody entirely expected. Modern humans and Neanderthals did not simply compete for the same land and the same herds. At some point repeatedly in various places they had children together. The way researchers actually catch this signal is worth pausing on for a moment. Every one of us carries genetic material inherited half from our mother and half from our father, and that material gets shuffled and passed down, generation after generation in recognizable patterns. When scientists compare the full genetic code of a Neanderthal skeleton against the genetic code of thousands of people alive today, certain stretches of that code line up too closely, too consistently to be explained by simple shared ancestry, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Those particular stretches look instead exactly like segments passed down through direct, comparatively recent interbreeding inherited copy for copy, the way a very specific family trait might reappear in a photograph 3 generations apart. According to one of the most precise studies completed on this question, the interbreeding between our species happened mainly during a single sustained stretch of time, beginning somewhere near 50,000 years ago and continuing for roughly 7,000 years afterward, before Neanderthal populations began vanishing from the record entirely. The genetic echo of that stretch of contact is still sitting quietly inside almost every person alive today, whose ancestry traces outside Africa, typically somewhere between 1 and 2% of their entire genetic code. Have you ever taken one of those ancestry tests that hands you a small percentage of Neanderthal genetic material as part of your results, and wondered what that number was actually telling you? It is not a metaphor, and it is not marketing. It is a literal, measurable inheritance passed down through thousands of generations, from actual relationships between 2 different kinds of human beings who happen to share the same valleys, the same rivers, and eventually the same families. Some people carry a slightly higher percentage than others, a small, quiet reminder that this particular chapter of our history did not affect every family line in exactly the same way. So why did it take modern science so long to admit this was happening? Was it simply a lack of good enough tools to detect such a small genetic signal? Or was there something a little more stubborn at work? A reluctance to imagine our own ancestors choosing partners so far outside what we consider fully human? Some researchers argue the delay was almost entirely technical, that earlier generations of scientists simply did not have equipment sensitive enough to detect such a faint genetic signal buried among everything else. Others suspect something nearer to bias, a long-standing assumption that Neanderthals were simple, brutish, and fundamentally separate from us, made it easier to overlook evidence that quietly pointed the other way for years before anyone took it seriously. Maybe the delay really was just a matter of waiting for better instruments. Maybe an old assumption about who deserved to be called fully human got in the way of the evidence for longer than it should have. Or maybe, and this feels closest to being honest about ourselves, it was some uncomfortable mixture of both. It is worth sitting with how recently this entire picture changed. For most of the 20th century, the word Neanderthal was practically a synonym for stupidity in casual conversation, an insult aimed at anyone acting a little slow or a little brutish. An entire branch of the human family was quietly turned into a punchline based largely on early incomplete reconstructions and a set of assumptions nobody had seriously tested. It took genetic evidence arriving only within the last 20 years or so to finally correct a reputation that had been unfairly settled for the better part of a century. Neanderthals were not the only company we kept out there. Considerably further east in the foothills of the Altai Mountains in Siberia, researchers working in a cave in the year 2010 recovered a tiny fragment of finger bone barely large enough to notice among the rubble. It had originally been catalogued alongside other Neanderthal material without a second thought, one small fragment among thousands, until someone finally ran a full genetic analysis on it back at the laboratory. Genetic testing revealed something nobody had a name ready for an entirely separate group of ancient humans, closely related to Neanderthals but clearly distinct, now known as the Denisovans. We have never found so much as a complete skull belonging to this group. What we do have remarkably is their genetic legacy scattered across the modern world in patterns almost too specific to be coincidence. Consider Tibet. People settled on that high, thin-walled plateau today carry a version of a particular gene that helps their bodies handle dramatically lower oxygen levels than almost anywhere else humans call home, allowing them to cope with air holding around 40% less oxygen than what most of us breathe comfortably at sea level, without the dangerous thickening of the blood that tends to affect newcomers to that altitude. Researchers tracing the exact shape of that gene found it did not evolve locally at all. It matches almost precisely the same gene recovered from Denisovan remains, passed down through interbreeding, then carefully preserved by natural selection, because it happened to be the difference between thriving and struggling to breathe at extreme altitude. A group of people that no longer exists left behind a gift that still helps millions of people breathe easier on a mountain plateau today. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the old migration map in Papua New Guinea and across parts of the wider Pacific, modern populations carry a considerably larger share of Denisovan ancestry, in some communities reaching nearer to 5% of their entire genetic code evidence of a separate, deeper mixing that happened somewhere along the long coastal route we spent time exploring earlier tonight. And then in the year 2018 came a discovery that startled even researchers who thought they had already seen the most surprising thing this field had to offer. Buried among more than 2,000 unidentified bone fragments recovered from that same Siberian cave, sat a single, unremarkable-looking sliver roughly the size of a fingernail. Genetic testing on it revealed something almost nobody expected. The fragment belonged to a person who had not survived past early adolescence and whose remains had rested there for roughly 90,000 years. Researchers were able to tell which parent belonged to which group using the same kind of maternal line tracing we talked about earlier tonight, the genetic material passed down strictly from mother to child. That particular thread pointed toward Neanderthal ancestry, while the rest of her genetic code inherited from both parents equally carried an unmistakable Denisovan half as well. Her mother, the testing showed, was Neanderthal. Her father was Denisovan, not a distant relative carrying faint traces of both groups mixed in generations earlier. A direct first-generation child of two entirely separate kinds of ancient human, identified by pure chance among a pile of unsorted fragments nobody expected to matter at all. Is that a coincidence, a single improbable meeting captured purely by luck? Or does finding a first-generation hybrid this quickly among such a tiny handful of remains ever recovered suggest meetings like hers were happening constantly all across ancient Eurasia, in places we simply have not thought to dig yet? And how many other family stories exactly like hers were quietly lost forever, with no fragment surviving at all to tell us they had ever happened? Researchers remain honestly divided. Some see her as a rare, almost accidental snapshot, a single crossing of paths preserved purely by chance, out of countless encounters that left no trace at all. Others argue the odds work the other way entirely, that finding a first-generation hybrid this quickly within such a small sample of ancient remains only makes sense if these kinds of meetings were happening far more often than anyone previously assumed. Maybe she was a rare exception, a single improbable crossing of paths. Maybe she was proof that different kinds of humans mixed far more casually and far more often than we ever gave them credit for. Or maybe most quietly of all, the very idea of treating these groups as separate sealed-off categories was always somewhat artificial to begin with. So what actually happened to them in the end? Neither Neanderthals nor Denisovans simply vanished overnight. Both populations appear to have declined slowly over thousands of years as modern humans continued arriving in greater numbers across the same landscapes they had called home for so long. Some researchers point to direct competition for food and shelter during an increasingly unstable climate, a slow squeeze rather than a sudden collapse. Others suspect something quieter, and in its own way sadder populations so small to begin with that repeated interbreeding with a much larger incoming group simply absorbed them generation after generation until there were no genetically distinct Neanderthals or Denisovans left to count only their genetic legacy, diluted and blended into an expanding population that eventually became all of us. There is a third possibility worth naming too, one that does not cancel out the other two so much as sit alongside them. Neanderthal populations across Europe appear to have been relatively small and thinly scattered, even at their healthiest, a pattern that leaves any group more vulnerable to ordinary bad luck, a difficult run of winters, disease passed along from the newcomers arriving in ever larger numbers, a single, especially harsh generation that simply produced fewer surviving children than the one before it. None of these explanations require a dramatic final battle or a single decisive moment. Extinction in this particular story looks far more like erosion than collapse. There is something worth sitting with in that particular ending. We often talk about Neanderthals and Denisovans as though they belong entirely to the past, a finished chapter, a species that failed where we succeeded. The truth carried inside your own genetic code tells a gentler story. They did not simply lose. In a very real sense, they joined us and never fully left. Every time you've ever handled cold, particularly well or poorly, every time a doctor has mentioned a gene linked to immune response or skin tone that traces back further than our species alone, there is a real chance you're looking at a small, quiet inheritance from a family line that supposedly ended in extinction tens of thousands of years ago. There is something almost funny in a quiet way about spending an entire century mocking a group of people for supposedly being simple and unsophisticated, only to discover once the evidence finally caught up that a fair number of us have been carrying pieces of them around inside our own bodies the entire time. If anyone has ever teased you for a stubborn streak or a particular sensitivity to cold, you now have a slightly more interesting excuse ready than simply blaming your own family. Do you know your own percentage? If you have ever taken one of those tests, I have always found it strangely moving to imagine that number not as a piece of trivia, but as an actual literal thread connecting you to a real person, standing in a real valley, tens of thousands of years before either of you had any way of knowing the other would ever matter. And once modern humans had spread across nearly every landscape connected by dry land, met and mixed with whichever older cousins they encountered along the way, one enormous obstacle still stood between them and the rest of the world. Not a mountain range, not a desert. Open water stretching further than anyone had ever needed to travel before toward a coastline nobody in their family had ever even heard rumoured to exist. Crossing it would require something entirely new, a leap of nerve and knowledge that had nothing to do with meeting other kinds of humans, and everything to do with facing the ocean itself. Every ocean crossing we have talked about so far involved land that a person could, at least in theory, still glimpse from where they started. This next one did not. Picture a narrow beach somewhere in what is now Indonesia, strung along a chain of islands stretching out into open water like stepping stones laid down by something enormous. A small group stands at the edge of the surf beside a simple raft, lashed together from bamboo and vine loaded with dried fish, fresh water sealed inside hollowed gourds, and whatever else the coming days might demand. An older woman checks the lashings one final time, tugging at each knot with the flat of her palm, while a younger man crouches at the waterline watching the pattern of the swell for a lull worth timing their launch around. Somewhere out past the horizon, past water deeper and more restless than anything their grandparents ever needed to cross, lies land. Nobody in their family has ever seen, ever described, or ever returned from to confirm was even there at all. This was not the first island they had crossed to reach this point. Reaching this particular beach had already meant island hopping across a scattered chain stretching more than 1,000 miles from the Asian mainland, each crossing a little further from anything familiar than the one before it, some gaps narrow enough to see across, others stretching far beyond the horizon in either direction. And this final stretch of water separated something far older and far stranger than distance alone. A 19th century naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace was the first to notice something odd while cataloguing wildlife across this same island chain. On one side of an invisible line running through the middle of Indonesia, the animals looked distinctly Asian tigers, elephants, monkeys swinging through familiar-looking forest. Cross that same line, sometimes only a narrow strait of water, and the wildlife changed entirely. Kangaroos, cockatoos, creatures found nowhere else on the planet. Wallace spent years travelling the region by boat, and on foot filling notebook after notebook, with careful observations long before anyone had a name for the geological forces actually responsible for what he was seeing. What he had stumbled onto was a boundary carved by deep ocean trenches so old and so steep that no amount of ice age sea level dropping ever managed to bridge them with dry land. Unlike the narrow strait that had let earlier travellers walk almost the entire way out of Africa, this particular gap had remained open water for millions of years, a permanent uncrossable wall for nearly every land animal that ever tried. Nearly every land animal, it turns out, except one. Here is the reversal worth sitting with. For a long time, the story handed down about our earliest ancestors imagined them almost exclusively as walkers, following coastlines, tracking rivers, moving wherever their own 2 feet could carry them. This crossing rewrites that picture completely. Reaching the landmass that would eventually become Australia and New Guinea required something no earlier chapter of our species had ever needed: boats capable of surviving open ocean built with enough foresight to carry food, water, and very likely more than one attempt before anyone succeeded. How many rafts were lost before one finally made it across? How many families pushed off from that same beach and simply never returned their fate, never recorded anywhere except in the silence that followed? What does it take to keep trying? A crossing like that, generation after generation, with absolutely no proof waiting on the other side, was worth the risk. And what kind of courage does it take to be the one who says, after hearing about every failed attempt before yours, that you're still going to try? Researchers studying this particular migration describe something that sounds almost like a slow, patient act of faith, repeated across many lifetimes. Some argue the crossing itself may not have been quite as blind as it first sounds, pointing out that enormous columns of cloud tend to build up over large tropical land masses, visible from a considerable distance out at sea, a subtle signal that solid ground waited somewhere beneath that particular patch of sky. Others are far more cautious, arguing there is no way to know for certain whether early travellers understood or relied on any such signal at all, and that the crossing may simply have been undertaken on hope momentum and whatever courage a shrinking crowded island chain eventually demands of the people settled on it. Maybe distant clouds really did offer a usable clue that land was waiting. Maybe the crossing happened with no real evidence at all, purely on faith and the growing pressure of a world running out of new islands to settle. Or maybe, and this feels like the most human answer available, it was both a mixture of genuine observation and simple, stubborn hope. This same combination that pushes most difficult decisions along even today. No physical boat from this era has ever survived for researchers to examine directly, which leaves a real gap in exactly what these vessels looked like. What we do have is a kind of process of elimination. A crossing this wide, repeated enough times to eventually succeed, almost certainly required something more capable than a single log or a loosely bound raft drifting wherever the current happened to push it. Most researchers studying this question lean towards some form of built watercraft bamboo rafts, lashed with fibre rope, or simple dugout-style boats, seaworthy enough to be steered and paddled with real intention rather than simply set adrift and hoped for the best. Recent genetic research has added an unexpected layer to this story. For years, scientists debated whether this migration happened as one single decisive crossing or unfolded more messily across multiple attempts. The newest evidence suggests something nearer to the second picture, tracing two distinct genetic lineages among the descendants of this migration, one tracing back through a northern route, roughly through what is now the Philippines, and another through a more southern path nearer to mainland Southeast Asia. A researcher named Martin Richards, working through this genetic evidence with his team, found that most descendants alive today trace their ancestry back through that northern route, suggesting it may have carried the larger, more successful share of the original migration. So this was not one triumphant voyage arriving all at once to claim an empty continent. It was several separate journeys taken by people who very likely never knew the others existed, converging by accident on the same distant shore, sometimes separated by generations, sometimes by hundreds of miles of coastline. Neither group had any way of knowing the other was walking. Reconstructing exactly how wide that final gap of open water actually was requires its own kind of detective work. Researchers combine data on ancient sea levels calculated from ice cores and ocean sediment with detailed maps of the modern sea floor, effectively rewinding the tide by tens of thousands of years to recreate the coastline as it would have looked at the moment people actually attempted the crossing. Even at the lowest point of the Ice Age, when huge amounts of the world's water sat locked away in glaciers, the most generous reconstructions still leave a stretch of open water measured in dozens of miles with nothing resembling a chain of visible stepping stones across the final approach. Once they arrived, the evidence tells us something equally remarkable. At a rock shelter in the far north of the continent, a site now known as Majed Baby, archaeologists led by a researcher named Chris Clarkson have uncovered tools and processed plant remains dated to somewhere between 65,000 and 53,000 years old, making it among the very earliest confirmed evidence of people anywhere on this new landmass. and the plants recovered there were not simply the easiest, most convenient food lying around waiting to be eaten. Several of them required real preparation, grinding, soaking, or careful handling to remove natural toxins before they could be safely consumed. The same excavation turned up something else worth pausing on. Buried in that same deep ancient layer sat the oldest known ground-edge stone axes ever found anywhere on the planet, carefully shaped and polished tools unlike anything being made elsewhere in the world at that same moment in history. And scattered right alongside them quantities of processed red and yellow ochre, echoing on an entirely different continent, the same instinct for colour and preparation we spent time with at the very start of tonight's journey. Whatever it was that first pushed people to grind stone into paint back on that African coastline, it had clearly travelled with them the entire way, resurfacing thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years later on a continent nobody in their family had ever set foot on before. In other words, within what may have been only a handful of generations of stepping onto a completely unfamiliar continent, people had already worked out through trial, careful observation, and no small amount of nerve exactly which plants could kill them, precisely what needed to be done to make them safe instead, and had invented tool technology nobody else on Earth would develop for tens of thousands of years afterward. Have you ever moved somewhere completely new and had to relearn even the smallest, most basic parts of daily life simply because everything familiar was suddenly gone? I think about that whenever I picture this particular chapter of the story, except multiply the stakes by roughly every plant, every animal, and every single unfamiliar danger a brand new continent could possibly offer. There was no elder from a previous generation to ask which berries were safe, which snakes to avoid, or which season brought the floods. Every single answer had to be worked out from nothing tested carefully and then remembered well enough to pass along. Once people had established themselves along this new coastline, the pace at which they spread outward is almost difficult to comprehend. Researchers modelling this expansion estimate the entire continent, an area larger than the whole of Europe, was substantially settled within somewhere around 4,000 to 6,000 years, an extraordinarily rapid pace considering these were small, scattered family groups on foot, carrying everything they owned, adapting constantly to landscapes ranging from tropical rainforest to bone-dry desert to cold, wet mountain country, often within the same single lifetime of travel. Some of these same family lines would go on to become the ancestors of the oldest continuous cultures still practiced anywhere on the planet today, unbroken for tens of thousands of years, in a way almost nowhere else on Earth can rival. It is worth pushing back gently on a version of this story that still shows up far too often, the lazy assumption that once people settled a place, this ancient life there simply stayed still, unchanged for tens of thousands of years afterward. The tools recovered at Majed Bebe alone put that idea firmly to rest. Grinding technology, axe production, and pigment processing did not appear once and then freeze in place. Researchers studying the site describe a slow, steady stream of small refinements and adjustments stretching across the entire 65,000-year record evidence of a population continuing to experiment, adapt, and innovate for tens of thousands of years, long after the initial excitement and terror of first arrival had worn off. Some researchers argue this rapid spread reflects a population actively searching outward for the richest, most reliable resources available, moving quickly toward good water and abundant food wherever it could be found. Others suspect something a little different, that having just proven to themselves through an entire chain of ocean crossings that the unknown was survivable, this particular population may simply have carried forward a kind of momentum, a willingness to keep pushing into new territory that groups settled comfortably for generations rarely need to develop. It is worth remembering that both explanations describe the same underlying trait, a population that had already quite literally crossed water most of the natural world considered impassable, and had no particular reason left to fear whatever waited over the next horizon. Maybe it was pure practicality chasing resources wherever the land was kindest. Maybe it was something nearer to momentum, an entire culture that had learned through repeated necessity not to fear the unfamiliar. Or maybe, most honestly, both explanations were simply true at once: practicality and courage, rarely travelling far apart from each other in any story worth telling. There is something worth carrying with you from this particular chapter, something a little larger than boats and islands. Every crossing we have talked about tonight so far involved some form of visible reassurance. A narrowed strait, a lower sea level, a familiar shoreline receding rather than disappearing completely. This one did not offer any of that. The people who first reached this distant continent stepped off dry land into open water with no guarantee whatsoever that anything but more ocean waited on the other side, and they did it anyway repeatedly until it finally worked. That kind of decision rarely gets remembered by name. No single hero gets credited with discovering an entire continent, the way later, far more recent voyages sometimes are. This story belongs instead to countless unnamed families, most of whom likely never made it, quietly building the knowledge, the confidence, and the raw nerve that the ones who eventually succeeded were able to draw on. Success, once again, turns out to rest on the shoulders of an awful lot of quiet, forgotten failure. Is there a decision in your own life you can trace back to someone else's failed attempt at the exact same thing? A lesson learned the hard way by a parent, a friend, or even a stranger that quietly saved you from repeating their mistake? I suspect most of us are standing on more of those than we usually stop to notice. And while boats and open water were carrying some of our ancestors toward entirely new continents, a very different kind of challenge was gathering around the family lines, who had chosen instead to keep moving further north into landscapes growing steadily colder, harsher, and less forgiving with every passing generation. No amount of clever boat building was going to help them there. What they would need instead was something almost the opposite: the patience and ingenuity to make an increasingly frozen world livable, one long, dark winter at a time. Cold is a patient enemy. It does not arrive all at once the way a volcano or a flood does. It simply takes a little more from you each year until one day you realize the world your grandparents described no longer exists at all. Somewhere on the frozen plains of what is now Western Russia, inside a low shelter built against the constant press of the cold, a woman sits near a small fire with a fragment of mammoth ivory balanced across her knee. In her hands, a slender stone tool worn smooth from use. She's not making a weapon. She's not preparing food. She's shaping a single bead no larger than a fingernail, carefully rounding the edges, then boring a hole through its center with a technique that requires a steady hand and an almost unreasonable amount of patience. She has made hundreds of these. She will make hundreds more. Somewhere outside the shelter, the ground is frozen solid enough to break stone tools against it. The nearest tree line, if there is one at all, sits days of walking away. And here she is in the harshest conditions our species had ever attempted to survive, spending an entire afternoon on decoration. That single detail rearranges almost everything most of us assume about this stretch of time. To understand just how strange our afternoon is, you need a sense of the world outside that shelter. Earth was sliding toward the deepest cold of the entire Ice Age, a stretch that peaked somewhere around 26 to 19,000 years ago. So much of the planet's water was locked into ice sheets that global sea levels sat roughly 400 feet lower than they do today. Ice sheets more than a mile thick covered much of northern Europe and northern North America. The plains where she sits were not buried under glaciers, but they were something arguably harder to survive: a vast, dry, bitterly exposed grassland where winter lasted most of the year and the growing season barely lasted at all. This was not a landscape that rewarded decoration. The site is now known as Sungir, uncovered on the outskirts of a Russian city during excavations that ran across 2 decades of the 20th century. What archaeologists found there preserved in ground that had stayed cold enough to protect it for roughly 34,000 years remains among the most extraordinary discoveries in the entire study of ancient humans. The burials at Sungir contained more than 10,000 mammoth ivory beads, not 10,000 ordinary items, 10,000 individually carved, individually pierced, individually polished beads sewn in dense rows across clothing that had long since rotted away, leaving only the beads themselves lying in the precise patterns they once decorated. Alongside them carved ivory armbands, hundreds of pierced fox teeth spears made from mammoth tusks that had somehow been straightened, a feat of engineering, requiring the ivory to be soaked, heated, and slowly forced into a new shape over what must have been an enormous stretch of time. Take that last detail on its own for a second. Mammoth tusks curve dramatically. To produce a straight spear from one, someone had to understand that ivory softens under sustained heat and moisture, work out a method for holding it under pressure while it cooled, and then be willing to wait as long as that process demanded. That is not improvisation. That is applied material science performed by people with no writing, no formal training, and no way to pass the technique along except by showing someone else patiently in person. Experimental archaeologists, meaning researchers who sit down and actually attempt these techniques using period-appropriate tools, estimate that a single one of those beads required roughly 45 minutes of skilled work. Do that arithmetic for a moment. 10,000 beads, roughly 7,500 hours of labour, for clothing that would be buried in the ground and never seen again. Put that number into a shape you can actually feel. 7,500 hours is the equivalent of one person working an ordinary full-time job, 40 hours a week for almost 4 straight years, with no holidays and no weekends off, producing nothing edible, nothing that keeps anyone warmer, nothing that improves anyone's odds of surviving the next winter by a single day. And they did it during an ice age. So what were they doing? Was this a display of status, a way of announcing that certain individuals mattered more than others? Was it grief expressed in the only currency these people had, which was time and effort? Or was it something we do not have a comfortable modern word for at all? The evidence at Sungir does point clearly towards some form of social distinction. One adult man, roughly 40 years old at the time of his death, was buried with around 3,000 beads, along with pierced fox canines and carved ivory armbands. Other individuals from the same site were buried with far less and a few with almost nothing at all. That variation matters. It suggests these were not people who treated every death identically. Somebody decided who received what. Some researchers see this as early evidence of social hierarchy, an emerging sense that certain people occupied a higher position within the group, whether through leadership, skill lineage, or something we cannot reconstruct. Others push back, arguing that the amount of grave goods might reflect the circumstances of a particular death, rather than the standing of the person in life, a sudden loss, an unusually beloved member of the community, or a moment when the group happened to have the resources and the will to make an enormous gesture. Maybe it was status carefully signalled in ivory. Maybe it was grief expressed at a scale we no longer have the patience for. Or maybe most quietly of all those two things were never separate to begin with, and we are simply looking at people doing what people have always done, using whatever they have to say that someone mattered. There's another detail from Sungir worth sitting with one that says something rather kind about the people who left it behind. Analysis of the remains indicates that several of the individuals buried there had physical conditions that would have limited their ability to move, hunt, or contribute in the ways survival on a frozen plain normally demands. And yet they had clearly been cared for, fed and sheltered through years of an environment that offered no margin whatsoever for carrying anyone who could not carry themselves. That is not a small thing. In the hardest conditions our species had faced up to that point, with every calorie hard won, and every winter a genuine threat, these people chose to support members of their community who could not fully support themselves. And then when those individuals died, they spent thousands of hours honouring them. Have you ever noticed how the most generous people you know are rarely the ones with the most to spare? I think about that a great deal when I sit with this particular site. There is one more thing about Sungir that I keep returning to, And it has nothing to do with ivory or status. It has to do with time. Those beads were not made in a burst of grief in the days between a death and a burial. 7,500 hours does not fit inside a week of mourning, which means the clothing found in those graves was almost certainly made long before anyone needed it worn during life, or prepared slowly across years for a purpose everyone in the community already understood. These people were not improvising a ceremony. They were following a tradition, one with rules, expectations, and a shared sense of what a proper farewell required. Somewhere in the middle of an ice age on a frozen plain 34,000 years ago, people had funerals, not disposals. Funerals with all the planning and expense that word still implies today. Let's step back from the graves for a moment and consider what daily survival actually required out here, because the practical achievement is every bit as remarkable as the ceremonial one. The human body is tropical equipment. We evolved in warm African landscapes with very little natural insulation, a thin covering of body hair, and a cooling system built around sweating rather than retaining heat. Nothing about our physical design suits a frozen plain, which means every single person surviving in this landscape was doing so entirely through invention, and food presented its own arithmetic problem. In a cold environment, the human body burns calories simply to maintain its own temperature, meaning a person working outdoors on that plain likely needed considerably more food each day than the same person would need in a warm climate. Meanwhile, the plants that make up so much of a mild weather diet were for most of the year simply absent, which left meat and fat as the foundation of nearly everything, and meant that hunting failures did not just mean an unpleasant week, they meant a crisis. The single most important invention that made any of this possible may be one of the least dramatic objects ever made: a needle. Specifically a needle with an eye, a small hole bored through one end allowing sinew or plant fibre to be pulled through hide with precision. Before the eyed needle clothing meant hides draped, wrapped and tied around the body, warm enough for a cold night. Nowhere near warm enough for a landscape where the temperature could stay well below freezing for months at a stretch. The eyed needle changed that completely because it made tailoring possible: fitted sleeves, sealed seams, layered garments that trapped warm air against the skin rather than letting it escape at every gap. The oldest examples we have found date back somewhere around 40 to 50,000 years, recovered from sites across northern Eurasia. Which means that within a remarkably short window in evolutionary terms, our species went from being fundamentally unequipped for cold to being capable of settling regions where winter lasts more than half the year. Not by changing our bodies, by changing what we put on them. There is a small indirect line of evidence for this that I find rather charming. Researchers studying the evolutionary history of body lice, the particular variety that survives in clothing rather than hair, have used genetic analysis to estimate roughly when that lineage split off and began specializing in fabric. The timing lines up broadly with the period when humans began wearing fitted layered garments, regularly enough to create an entirely new habitat for an insect. Our ancestors did not simply invent clothing. They invented it thoroughly enough that something else evolved to move in. Shelter followed the same pattern of stubborn ingenuity. On the open plains where wood was scarce or absent entirely, people built structures out of the only abundant building material available: mammoth bone. Excavations across parts of Ukraine and Russia have uncovered the remains of dwellings assembled from hundreds of mammoth bones, skulls arranged as foundations, tusks curved into archways, the whole frame very likely covered with hides and packed earth. Consider what that actually required. Not simply the strength to haul enormous bones across frozen ground, but the planning to gather them, the knowledge of which bones would bear weight and which would not, and the willingness to invest weeks of collective labour into a structure that might only serve for a season or two. A single one of these dwellings could consume the bones of dozens of animals, arranged with enough structural sense to stand against months of storms on an open plain. Where do you think those bones came from? Were these people hunting mammoths directly at enormous personal risk, or were they doing something far more sensible and simply collecting bones from animals that had already died, naturally accumulating over years across a landscape where nothing rots quickly? Researchers disagree, and the honest answer is probably both. Some sites show clear evidence of hunting with weapon damage visible on bones. Others contain bones weathered in ways suggesting they lay exposed on the surface for a long time before anyone gathered them. What seems clear is that these communities treated the landscape as a resource to be studied, carefully gathered patiently, and used with an eye toward the coming winter rather than simply the coming week. There is something worth carrying with you from this frozen chapter, and it is not really about the cold at all. Everything we have talked about tonight so far involved people responding to a world that was in some fundamental sense survivable. Warm coastlines, green corridors, islands with fresh water. This chapter is different. These were people making a home in a place that actively, continuously tried to kill them and choosing to stay anyway. And they did not simply endure it. They carved beads. They sewed decorated clothing. They buried their dead with extraordinary care. They looked after people who could not look after themselves. The Ice Age did not strip our ancestors down to raw survival instinct the way most of us probably assume it would have. If anything, the evidence suggests the opposite. The harder the world became, the more determined these communities appear to have been about beauty ritual and each other. I find that quietly reassuring in a way that has very little to do with ancient history. It suggests that the impulse toward care and toward beauty is not a luxury we develop once life becomes comfortable. It seems instead to be something we reach for hardest precisely when things are at their worst. You may have noticed something like this in your own life or in the people around you. The handmade gift during a difficult year. The meal cooked with unreasonable care for someone going through something hard. The stubborn insistence on marking an occasion properly even when nobody would blame you for skipping it. If you have ever done something like that or had someone do it for you, you are reaching for exactly the same thing those bead makers were reaching for on a frozen plain 34,000 years ago. And while some of these communities were pressing further north into the ice, others warmer and further south were doing something with their long winter evenings that would leave behind the most breathtaking record any of these people ever created, hidden inside caves where nobody would find it for tens of thousands of years. Not every mountain hides fire and ash underneath it. Some mountains, it turns out, hide something far quieter, tucked away inside their limestone bones for tens of thousands of years, waiting for someone with a flashlight and a great deal of patience to finally notice it. Deep inside a limestone cave on the island of Sulawesi, in what is now Indonesia, a figure crouches near the rock wall, working by the low shifting light of a small fire. In one hand, a lump of dark red mineral pigment. The wall in front of this person already carries the beginnings of a scene. A wild pig, heavy and low to the ground, rendered in confident practice strokes. Small human-shaped figures stand near it, spears raised, caught mid-motion, frozen forever in a single moment of pursuit. Outside the island breathes the way it probably always has. Warm, damp air drifting through limestone towers cloaked in tangled green. Somewhere far off, a bird calls twice and falls silent. Inside this particular chamber, though, none of that seems to matter. What matters is the pig on the wall and the small figures gathering in around it and getting the whole scene exactly right before the fire burns down too low to see by. This is not a doodle. It is not idle decoration on an empty wall. It is a story laid out in a very specific order, meant to be looked at, followed and understood by someone else long after the fire that lit it had gone cold. For a long time, if you had asked almost any historian where human beings first started telling stories through pictures, the answer would have pointed you toward Europe, toward the painted caves of France and Spain, places with names that have become almost shorthand for the dawn of human creativity. That was the accepted timeline for decades. Real image-making, real storytelling through art was supposed to have started there sometime after modern humans arrived on the continent. Sulawesi quietly and quite thoroughly rewrites that timeline, using a fairly new dating method, one that involves shaving off a sample smaller than a grain of rice from the mineral crust that slowly forms over old cave paintings. Researchers have determined that this particular hunting scene, discovered in a cave known as Liang Karampuang, is at least 51,200 years old. Not 40,000, not 45,000, over 51,000 years old, painted by people who called this island home, long before most viewers of this story have probably ever had a reason to think about it. Sit with that for a moment, because it truly rearranges the picture. The famous painted caves of France, the ones most of us picture when we imagine the birth of art, are around 37,000 years old at their oldest. This scene in Sulawesi is older than that by well over a decade of thousands of years. Whatever it was that first pushed a human being to pick up pigment and tell a story on stone, it did not begin in Europe. It began here on a tropical island in a cave most of the world had never heard of until researchers stumbled across it. So why did the old story last as long as it did? Part of the answer is simply about attention and where scientists chose to dig. European caves were mapped, studied and celebrated for well over a century. Southeast Asia, by comparison, received a small fraction of that same curiosity, despite holding hundreds of limestone caves scattered across its islands. It took a small team of Australian and Indonesian researchers working carefully through cave after cave on Sulawesi to finally ask a very simple question that had somehow gone unasked for far too long. What if we are just looking in the wrong place? An archaeologist named Adam Broom, who has spent a large part of his career on this exact question, has described the moment his team first properly examined this particular chamber as something near disbelief. Local communities on Sulawesi had known about painted caves scattered across their island for generations, treating them as an ordinary, unremarkable part of the landscape. It took careful, patient testing cave after cave, year after year, before scientists finally understood exactly how old these ordinary-looking walls truly were. And every time the dating techniques improved even slightly, the numbers kept climbing higher, not lower, forcing the same team to revise their own published findings again and again, always in the same direction, always further back in time than they had dared to claim before. Now here is where the story gets remarkably strange in the best possible way. Look closely at those small human-shaped figures surrounding the pig, and something starts to feel slightly off. Their bodies are human enough, arms raised, legs bent mid-stride, but several of them appear to carry features that are not human at all. A pointed snout here, a tail curling out from behind one figure, a head shaped less like a person and more like a bird or perhaps a reptile. Researchers have a word for figures like these. They call them therianthropes, beings that blend human and animal characteristics into a single form. And their presence in a painting this old raises a question that reaches far beyond art itself. Does drawing a being that could not possibly exist in the real world require something we might call imagination? The ability to combine memory with invention, to picture something that has never actually been seen purely inside your own mind? Some researchers argue yes, and argue it fairly firmly. They see these hybrid figures as some of the earlier solid evidence we have for a belief in something beyond the physical world. Spirits, perhaps. Ancestors wearing the shape of animals. Early threads of what would eventually grow into organized religion tens of thousands of years later. Others urge a little more caution before reaching for a word as loaded as religion. Perhaps these figures were simply hunters wearing animal skins and skulls, as disguises, a practical trick for approaching wary prey, later exaggerated slightly in the retelling around a fire. Perhaps a good story, much like today, simply grew a little taller with every person who told it again. Maybe it was spiritual belief taking its very first visible shape. Maybe it was something more like costume and clever hunting strategy. Or maybe, and this is worth sitting with, the two are never as separate to the person who painted this as they are to us thinking about it from so many thousands of years away. There is an older cousin to this idea worth mentioning here, though it comes from an entirely different part of the world. In a cave in Germany, researchers uncovered a small ivory figurine carved with the body of a person and the head of a cave lion dated to roughly 40,000 years ago. For years, this single carved figure held the record as the earliest known example of a human, imagining a being that blended person and animal. Sulawesi's painted hunters, discovered later, are now believed to be considerably older, still quietly moving that particular record from a cold European cave to a warm island cave on the opposite side of the world. There is one more twist worth mentioning purely because it refuses to sit quietly. A handful of researchers working in Spain have claimed something even bolder, that certain simple hand shapes stenciled onto cave walls that may stretch back over 64,000 years, painted before modern humans are believed to have reached that part of Europe at all. If true, that would mean the artist pressing pigment around their own palm was not one of us in the strict sense, but a Neanderthal. Other researchers have pushed back hard against that particular claim, questioning the dating methods used and the assumptions behind them. The debate remains unsettled and probably will for a while yet. But even the possibility is enough to loosen an idea most of us hold on to without ever examining it closely. The quiet assumption that picture-making has always belonged to us and only us alone. A fair question might be forming in your mind right about now. How can anyone possibly trust a date this old coming from a technique that shaves off a sample smaller than a grain of rice? It comes down to a slow natural process happening inside the cave itself, whether anyone is watching or not. Water seeping through limestone carries tiny amounts of dissolved minerals, and over thousands of years those minerals settle out and form a thin glassy crust directly on top of old paintings, layer building quietly on layer. That crust holds trace amounts of naturally occurring radioactive elements decaying at a fixed, well understood and remarkably steady rate. By measuring how far that decay has progressed within the crust sitting directly above the paint, researchers can calculate a minimum age for whatever lies underneath it. Not a guess pulled from thin air, a number built from measurable, repeatable physics checked against multiple samples from multiple caves before a single figure is ever published. This newer approach solved a real practical headache for researchers. The older dating technique required scraping away a fairly substantial chunk of mineral crust, which meant scientists were often reluctant to test the most fragile, most important paintings at all, out of simple respect for keeping them intact. The newer method uses a focused laser to remove a sample, so small it barely leaves a mark visible to the naked eye, which means far more paintings can finally be tested, and far more of Sulawesi's hidden timeline can finally come into focus. And once researchers had a reliable way to date these paintings, they stopped finding just one. They found dozens. Sulawesi alone now holds more than 240 separate caves and rock shelters containing ancient imagery, and new sites continue turning up nearly every year the researchers return to the field. A painting of a warty pig at a different cave nearby has been dated to at least 45,000 years old itself, older than any comparable image ever found in Europe. Layer by layer, cave by cave, an entire artistic tradition is slowly coming into view. Not a single lucky discovery. A sustained, ongoing culture of storytelling through pictures practiced by people on this island for tens of thousands of years, quietly overlapping with almost everything else this story has already carried you through. Picture the sheer stretch of time hiding inside that single number for a moment. 240 caves is not one artist working alone on one lucky afternoon. It is generation after generation of painters separated from each other by spans of time longer than the entire history of ancient Egypt, each one somehow inheriting or perhaps simply reinventing the same basic idea. Take a dark red stone, grind it down, use it to freeze a moment in time onto something that will still be standing long after you're gone. Did each new generation learn this from the one before it, an unbroken thread passed hand to hand across thousands of years? Or did the idea simply keep occurring to people again and again independently, because something about the human mind practically demands it? Nobody currently has a confident answer to that question, and it might be the most interesting open question in this entire story. Here is a small humbling thought worth carrying forward tonight. Somewhere around this same broad stretch of time, other descendants of these same wandering restless populations were pushing even further outward, crossing stretches of open ocean toward a landmass no human eye had ever rested upon before. The people painting this pig and the people preparing to sail toward the unknown may never have met each other, may never have known the other existed at all. And yet both were driven by something strikingly similar, a refusal to simply accept the world exactly as it was handed to them. One group turned that restlessness into travel across open water. The other turned it into colour pressed onto stone, a message meant to outlast the person who made it. Two very different responses to the exact same restless pulse running through our species. One measured in nautical miles crossed, the other measured in pigment ground fine enough to hold a shape for 51,000 years. Neither one is more remarkable than the other. If anything, they feel like two verses of the very same song sung in completely different keys on opposite sides of a single wide, warm ocean. Quick question for you before we move on tonight. If you had spent your whole life in a world with no writing, no camera, and nothing except firelight and a handful of natural pigment, what moment would you have chosen to paint onto a wall, knowing it might truly still be there 50,000 years later? Sit with that for a second. It is a stranger question than it first sounds. Maybe you have felt some quiet version of that same impulse yourself, the urge to capture a moment before it disappears completely, to leave some small trace of an experience behind for someone else to eventually find. Every photograph you have ever taken on a walk, every small story you have ever told a friend about something remarkable you once witnessed, is in its own modest way still doing exactly what that painter was doing inside a cave on Sulawesi over 51,000 years ago. The hands holding the pigment were not so different from yours. The instinct behind them certainly was not. There is something almost funny about it too, if you let yourself sit with it long enough. That painter, hunched over a limestone wall by firelight, almost certainly assumed the scene would fade within a season or two, worn away by damp air and passing time, the way most things people make tend to disappear. Instead, a mineral crust slowly grew directly on top of the paint, sealing the whole scene under a thin sheet of natural glass for tens of thousands of years, protecting it far better than any museum display case ever could. The cave itself, without knowing it, spent 51,000 years quietly guarding someone's homework, and while one small group was busy pressing colour onto limestone to make sure their story outlasted them, another set of footprints thousands of miles away, and thousands of years in the future from this exact moment, was about to be pressed into a very different kind of surface. Not stone this time, but soft, ancient mud on a continent that, as far as anyone could tell, no human being had ever reached before. That mud would hold its own secret for far longer than anyone painting tonight could ever have imagined, waiting patiently for its own turn to be found. Mud remembers things stone never bothers to. Given the right conditions, a single footprint pressed into soft ground can outlast the person who left it by tens of thousands of years, quietly waiting under layer after layer of dust for someone eventually to notice it was ever there at all. Picture a wide, shallow lakeshore in what is now the southern part of North America, sometime during the coldest stretch of the last ice age. The water sits low and grey under a heavy winter sky, ringed by pale, cracked flats, where the lake has already begun pulling back for the season. A hunter moves carefully along the muddy edge, breath showing faintly in the cold air, eyes fixed on a set of enormous tracks pressed into the ground ahead, tracks left by a giant ground sloth, an animal roughly the size of a small car, capable of turning around and defending itself with claws the length of a human forearm if it senses danger nearing. The hunter's own footprints, smaller and lighter, follow a careful weaving path alongside the sloth's trail, mirroring its turns, staying near enough to track it far enough to stay safe. Somewhere behind, other members of the group move at their own pace, spread out across the flat, muddy ground, each one leaving a private, unremarkable record of an entirely ordinary afternoon. Neither one of them had any idea they were about to become one of the most argued about pieces of evidence in the entire story of how humans reached this continent. For nearly a century, the accepted story of how people first arrived in North America went something like this. A group known to archaeologists through their distinctive finely worked stone spear points, people we now call the Clovis culture, crossed over from Siberia sometime around 13,000 years ago, walking a narrow temporary corridor that opened up as the great ice sheets covering the north finally began pulling apart. This was taught in classrooms for generations, printed in textbooks, repeated in documentary after documentary, treated as settled fact. It was more than just a date on a timeline. It became something near an identity for an entire field of study. Careers were built defending it. Entire museum exhibits were arranged around it. Any site that seemed to suggest an older date was almost automatically treated with deep suspicion, picked apart for flaws until it either collapsed under scrutiny or quietly faded from the conversation. Which is exactly why what happened next in a quiet corner of New Mexico landed with such force. Then, in a dry lake bed in New Mexico, a set of footprints turned that entire textbook chapter upside down. The tracks themselves were not even new to science. Researchers had noticed odd depressions in the hardened mud of this dry lake for years without fully grasping what they were looking at. It took a dedicated team spending seasons carefully excavating one narrow trench after another, following faint lines of disturbed sediment across a landscape that mostly just looks like flat cracked earth to an untrained eye before the true scale of what they had found became clear. Not one lucky footprint. Dozens, then eventually well over 60 separate human tracks layered across a lake bed that had clearly seen human feet cross it again and again and again. Researchers examining fossilized human tracks at a site now protected as a national park found something that at first seemed almost too strange to be correct. Trapped in the layers of mud directly above and below the footprints were tiny seeds from an aquatic plant, the kind that grows in shallow water and leaves seeds behind each season with almost clockwork regularity. By measuring the natural radioactive decay locked inside those seeds, scientists calculated an age for the footprints of somewhere between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. Say that number again slowly because it is worth letting it land properly. Not 13,000 years, over 20,000. Squarely in the middle of the harshest, coldest stretch of the entire Ice Age, a period when the very ice sheets that were supposed to block any path south had not even begun to open yet. So how did anyone get there before the door was supposedly unlocked? Understandably, plenty of scientists did not simply accept a claim this disruptive without a serious fight. Some questioned whether those aquatic seeds might have absorbed old carbon from the surrounding water itself, throwing off the entire calculation and making everything appear far older than it truly was. It is a fair, reasonable concern, exactly the kind of skepticism good science depends on. So a separate team went back to the same site this time, deliberately avoiding the plant seeds altogether. They dated pollen grains from land plants preserved in the very same mud layers, a completely different kind of material tested, using a completely different laboratory. And separately again they measured the last time individual grains of quartz sand had been exposed to sunlight, before becoming buried in an entirely different dating method, built on a completely different branch of physics. For anyone keeping track of how this species has been measuring its own past across its entire journey, that makes at least 5 distinct dating techniques used so far, each one built on a different natural process, each one arriving at trustworthy numbers through a completely different door. All three methods, tested by different teams using different materials and different techniques, landed on the same stretch of time. Think about how rare that kind of agreement actually is. 3 separate laboratories, 3 completely different physical processes, one built on decaying radioactive carbon, one built on the last flash of sunlight touching a grain of sand, one built on the seasonal growth of a plant, that has absolutely nothing to do with the other two. If even one of those methods had disagreed sharply with the others, the whole claim would likely have collapsed under its own weight. Instead, every single one pointed to the same narrow window of centuries, an outcome that is truly difficult to explain away as coincidence, contamination, or simple bad luck. An archaeologist named Vance Holliday, who has spent years working directly at this site, has described the moment those results came back as something near true disbelief. Watching a controversial, widely doubted claim slowly transform into one of the best confirmed dates in all of American archaeology. Maybe those first skeptics were simply doing their job properly and got it wrong through no fault of their own. Maybe the footprints really were exactly as strange and as old as they first appeared. Or maybe, and this feels like the most honest way to put it, science occasionally needs to be dragged kicking and doubting every step of the way toward a truth that was sitting patiently in the mud the entire time waiting to be believed. Here is a detail that tends to get lost in the arguments over dates and methods, though it might be the most remarkable part of the entire discovery. These are not just footprints from one single afternoon, one lone traveller passing through on a single unlucky day that happened to get preserved. Researchers have identified footprint layers stretching across roughly 2,000 years of repeated visits to the exact same lakeshore generation, folded on top of generation, all returning to the same patch of muddy ground beside the same shrinking lake. Among those layers sits one particular trackway that has quietly become famous among the researchers who study it closely. A set of adult-sized prints moving in a long, fairly straight line across the mud, occasionally interrupted by a smaller, lighter set of prints appearing right alongside them for a short stretch, before vanishing again. The pattern matches almost exactly what you would expect from someone carrying a small child on one hip for most of a journey, setting the child down now and then to rest an aching arm before picking them back up and continuing on. Whoever that person was walking a New Mexico lakeshore over 21,000 years ago was doing something achingly familiar. Managing a heavy, restless bundle on one side of the body and simply getting where they needed to go. Researchers who examined the size, depth and spacing of these particular prints believe they most likely belong to a woman moving briskly, possibly slightly hurried, based on the length and pace of her stride. On her return trip back across the very same stretch of mud sometime later, her tracks appear alone unaccompanied, suggesting she had set the child down somewhere safe before making the walk back a second time unburdened. It is a small, quiet detail to build an entire story around, and yet it is hard not to. If a stranger tens of thousands of years from now ever found a trace of your own ordinary Tuesday, what small, unremarkable detail do you suppose would end up meaning the most to them? Probably not the big dramatic moments you would expect. Rarely is it the achievement, the milestone, the thing you might actually choose to write down on purpose. More often, it is something small and unplanned. A worn path between 2 rooms, a particular chair pulled slightly too near a window. The quiet evidence of an ordinary existence simply unfolding one unremarkable footstep after another. Beyond the human story sitting inside that mud, there is an entire lost world layered right alongside it. Mammoth tracks cross the same lake bed. So do the tracks of dire wolves and camels an animal. Most people do not automatically associate with ancient North America, along with the enormous slow-moving ground sloths that clearly were not the least bit afraid to share this same shoreline with the humans walking beside them. One particular trackway shows sloth prints suddenly veering off course, the stride pattern shifting almost as though the animal had caught sight or scent of something nearby and adjusted its path in response. Researchers studying that particular set of prints have suggested it may capture something like a real, four-legged encounter between a person and an animal capable of killing them without much effort, frozen into the mud in real time. It is worth pausing to picture the actual scale of some of these creatures, because it is easy to say the words giant sloth without really feeling the weight behind them. Some of the larger ground sloths wandering this landscape could stand taller than a grown man on their hind legs, with claws built for tearing into tough vegetation, and occasionally, when cornered, for defending themselves against exactly the kind of small, persistent spear-carrying primate now leaving footprints beside them. Whoever pressed those human tracks into the mud that day was not strolling through some safe, tame version of nature. They were sharing a landscape with animals fully capable of ending an ordinary afternoon in an instant and choosing to walk out onto that lakeshore anyway. The old model held firmly to a tidy, orderly sequence. Ice sheets. Part people walk south through the middle of the continent, and only afterward do they meet the great beasts of the Ice Age. What this lake bed suggests instead is something far less tidy, and honestly far more interesting. People were almost certainly already sharing this same ground with mammoths and ground sloths for thousands of years before that inland corridor ever opened at all, which raises an obvious, slightly uncomfortable question. If walking straight through the middle of the continent was not actually possible yet, at this point how exactly did anyone get this far south in the first place? The answer most researchers currently favour points toward the coast rather than the continent's interior. Rather than marching overland through solid ice, early arrivals may have moved down the Pacific shoreline itself, following a coastline rich with kelp forests, shellfish beds and fish, using simple boats to island hop and shore hop their way steadily south. Generation by generation, along a route that largely stayed clear of ice even during the very worst of the cold. It is a theory that is difficult to prove directly, since rising sea levels since that era have quietly swallowed most of that original coastline. But it fits neatly with a species that had already, by this point in our story, crossed open ocean to reach a continent no human being had ever set foot on before. Maybe people trickled down the coast in small, cautious waves, family by family, boat by boat. Maybe a single determined group pushed further than anyone before them and simply never turned back. Or maybe, most quietly of all, we're still only seeing one small muddy corner of a much larger migration, whose full shape has not yet fully surfaced. Here is something worth turning over in your own mind for a moment. If the coastal route is correct, then the people who eventually left these tracks in New Mexico had already survived a journey stretching across an entire ocean's worth of shoreline generation, stacked upon generation, long before anyone thought to build a single pyramid temple or city anywhere on Earth. They were not the confident forward-marching pioneers so often pictured in old paintings planting a flag on virgin soil. They were simply following the coast, the food, and the next reasonable place to make camp one exhausted, ordinary day at a time, with absolutely no sense that they were making history. There is something worth sitting with tonight in the fact that this entire chapter nearly stayed buried for good. A lake bed that dried up, refilled and dried up again over and over across thousands of years, happened to seal each new layer of footprints under the next, almost perfectly protecting an ordinary walk to the water's edge, until researchers with the right tools and enough patience to keep questioning their own results finally arrived to uncover what the mud had been quietly holding on to the whole time. Somewhere in the middle of all this scientific back and forth, quartz grains and pollen counts and radiocarbon curves, it is worth stepping back and simply appreciating what we are actually looking at. Not a chart, not a debate between academics, an ordinary family on an ordinary day walking to fetch water or track a meal, never imagining for a single second that their footsteps would still be legible over 20,000 years later to strangers on the far side of an unimaginable stretch of time, straining to understand exactly who they were. And while these particular footprints tell a story of people slipping quietly, almost invisibly, onto a brand new continent somewhere far across the ocean, the very animals sharing that same muddy lakeshore with them were about to run out of time in a way nobody walking here could have possibly predicted. The world itself, the ice, the water, the climate holding this entire fragile balance together, was about to lurch violently, and it would happen faster than almost anything else in this whole long story. Most people picture climate change as something almost impossibly slow, centuries creeping by, glaciers retreating an inch at a time, decade after patient decade. What almost nobody expects is a switch being thrown practically overnight on a scale large enough to reshape an entire hemisphere. And yet roughly 12,900 years ago, that is essentially what happened, and the story of exactly how it happened turns out to connect almost everything this journey has shown you so far into one single sweeping moment. Picture a hunter standing at the edge of a familiar valley in North America, somewhere not too far from that same muddy lake shore we just spent time beside. For as long as anyone in this hunter's family can remember, told and retold, around fires stretching back generations, the world has been getting steadily warmer. The great ice sheets to the north have been shrinking. Rivers run fuller. Grasslands push further and further toward land that used to sit buried under permanent ice. This hunter has grown up hearing stories about a colder, harsher world, the kind of stories elders tell young people mostly to make a point about how good things have become. Nobody in this valley has any real reason to think that pattern might reverse. Warming, as far as anyone can remember, is simply the direction time moves. Then within this hunter's own lifetime, something goes badly wrong. Plants that used to bud reliably each spring start failing. Frost arrives earlier and lingers longer, gripping ground that had spent generations slowly warming. Herds that once could be tracked with predictable confidence begin thinning out, moving unpredictably, sometimes vanishing from familiar territory altogether. Older members of the group, the ones who remember the warmest years most clearly, begin trading uneasy glances around the fire at night, unwilling to say out loud the thing they are all quietly starting to suspect. It would take modern scientists working with ice cores drilled a mile deep in Greenland to eventually understand the sheer scale of what this hunter was moving through. By counting the yearly layers trapped inside that ancient ice, almost like counting rings inside a tree, researchers determined that temperatures across the northern hemisphere plunged by somewhere between 5 and 8 degrees within a single decade, and possibly far less than that. Not over 1,000 years, not even over 100. Within the span of one ordinary human life, the planet essentially flipped a switch and yanked itself backward into Ice Age conditions. Scientists name this sudden cold snap the Younger Dryas, borrowed from a small hardy flower that thrives in cold, harsh tundra, whose pollen shows up abruptly in sediment layers. From exactly this period, a tiny botanical fingerprint left behind by an enormous global event. There is something almost poetic about naming a hemisphere-wide catastrophe after a flower, as though scientists faced with a disaster this large needed something small and specific to hold on to a single delicate detail that could stand in for an event too vast to picture all at once. So what actually caused a shift this fast, this severe, and this precisely timed? The explanation most climate scientists currently favour centres on water, and an enormous amount of it. As the great ice sheets covering the north continued melting, they likely released a staggering pulse of fresh cold meltwater directly into the North Atlantic Ocean all at once, or near enough to it. That sudden flood of fresh water may have disrupted a critical ocean current system, one that normally carries warm water north from the tropics, acting almost like a conveyor belt that keeps large parts of the northern hemisphere far milder than their latitude alone would suggest. Slow that conveyor down or stall it out entirely, and the warmth it usually delivers simply stops arriving. There is a second explanation, considerably stranger and considerably more contested among researchers. A paleoceanographer named James Kennett, along with a handful of colleagues, proposed something bolder back in 2007. Digging through soil layers dated to this exact moment at more than 50 separate sites scattered across North America, researchers uncovered a thin dark band containing unusual concentrations of platinum, tiny magnetic spherules, and microscopic diamonds, materials researchers typically associate with a genuine cosmic impact. Their proposal was dramatic. A large comet or a cluster of fragments from one may have exploded in the atmosphere above the northern ice sheet, releasing enough heat and force to destabilize the ice itself and trigger the very same flood of meltwater the mainstream theory already points toward. What makes this particular idea so hard to simply dismiss is the sheer geographic spread of the evidence involved. This is not one strange rock formation in one unusual location that a skeptic could reasonably wave away as a local coincidence. Researchers report the very same thin telltale layer, carrying the very same unusual particles at sites scattered across multiple continents, all dating to the very same narrow slice of time. A sedimentary sequence studied in southern Chile, tens of thousands of miles from those original North American sites, has reportedly turned up strikingly similar material at exactly the same depth in the geological record. Plenty of other scientists have pushed back hard against this idea, questioning whether those unusual particles are really evidence of a cosmic impact at all, or simply the result of ordinary volcanic activity, wildfires, or contamination during sample collection. The debate has run for nearly 2 decades now without a tidy, universally accepted resolution. Maybe it was purely a slow build-up of melting ice reaching a tipping point on its own. Maybe something did strike the ice sheet from above and gave that tipping point a hard, sudden push. Or maybe, and this is where most careful researchers currently land, we are looking at some combination of both forces tangled together so thoroughly that untangling cause from effect may never be entirely possible. Whatever ultimately triggered it, the consequences for the animals sharing this planet with that hunter were catastrophic. Around this same narrow window of time, something extraordinary happened to the giant creatures we spent time with earlier this story. The mammoths, the towering ground sloths, the dire wolves, all animals whose tracks were still fresh in the mud beside that lakeshore we visited. Across North America alone, at least 35 entire genera of large mammals disappeared for good. Not 35 species within one type of animal. 35 entirely separate branches of the family tree gone within a remarkably narrow span of centuries. South America, further along in this same wave, appears to have lost roughly 50 genera of its own outsized creatures. Try to hold that scale in your mind for a moment, because numbers this large tend to slide right past us without actually landing. Imagine walking into a great hall, built to display every large mammal that had ever roamed North America throughout the Ice Age: camels, native horses, giant beavers the size of a modern bear saber, toothed cats, entire families of elephant relatives. Now, imagine returning to that same hall a handful of centuries later and finding most of the exhibits simply gone, their spaces standing empty with no replacement ever arriving to fill them. Why would so many different unrelated animals collapse all at once? Quick question worth sitting with before we go any further. If you had to guess right now which force feels more responsible for wiping out an entire Ice Age menagerie, a climate flipping violently backward within a single lifetime, or small bands of increasingly skilled human hunters spreading across a continent full of prey that had never learned to fear them? Hold on to your answer, because the real story turns out to be a little more uncomfortable than picking a single side. Researchers have argued over this question for decades, and the argument tends to split cleanly into 2 camps. One camp points squarely at climate. A world flipping suddenly back into Ice Age conditions would have devastated food supplies, shifted entire ecosystems within a single generation, and left slow-breeding, enormous-bodied animals with nowhere near enough time to adapt. The other camp points towards something far more familiar. An anthropologist named Paul Martin championed the idea that human hunters spreading rapidly across a continent full of animals with absolutely no evolved fear of a small cooperative spear-wielding primate simply hunted these giants into oblivion faster than their populations could ever recover. Here is a detail that tends to get lost in that particular argument. These two explanations are not actually competing with each other nearly as cleanly as the debate sometimes suggests. A species already pushed toward the edge by a collapsing climate becomes dramatically easier to finish off through hunting pressure that under gentler conditions it might have weathered without much trouble at all. Climate may have thrown open the door. Human hunters quite possibly simply walked through it. Maybe climate alone did the damage. Maybe human hunters delivered the final blow to animals already weakened by a collapsing world. Or maybe, and this feels closest to the honest complicated truth, both forces arrived together at precisely the worst possible moment for a slow, breeding giant with nowhere left to run. Think for a moment about what a loss on this scale would have actually meant for the people watching it happen. Not in abstract numbers of vanished genera, but in the texture of an ordinary life. Entire hunting strategies refined and passed down across countless generations, built specifically around animals that no longer existed. Tools shaped for a particular kind of hide, particular kind of bone suddenly without their intended purpose. Stories, songs, and hard-won knowledge about tracking a mammoth or reading a ground sloth's mood, all of it drifting slowly toward irrelevance within the space of a few short generations. Losing the megafauna was not simply an ecological event. For the people standing closest to it, it must have felt something like watching an entire way of understanding the world quietly come apart. If you want a strange kind of comfort in the middle of all the loss, consider this. The very crisis wiping out mammoths and ground sloths appears to have quietly pushed a different, much smaller kind of change into motion, one that would eventually reshape absolutely everything that came after it. Far from that same North American valley in a stretch of the Near East, where wild wheat and barley had for generations simply grown on their own each season, without anyone needing to plant a single seed, the Younger Dryas hit particularly hard. Rainfall dropped. Familiar wild grain fields, once reliable enough that people had built entire settled villages around gathering them, began failing season after disappointing season. Faced with a food source they could no longer simply count on nature to provide, some of these groups appear to have started doing something people had never systematically done before, deliberately saving seed from the healthiest plants, deliberately clearing ground and pressing that seed back into the soil themselves, rather than simply waiting for it to arrive on its own. Archaeologists digging through settlements from this exact window of time have found something quietly remarkable tucked away in the plant, remains left behind at cooking hearths and storage pits. A gradual shift in the size and shape of grain husks moving steadily away from the tough shatter-prone wild varieties that scatter their own seeds naturally towards slightly plumper, slightly more cooperative versions that hold their seeds together long enough for a person to gather the whole plant intact. Nobody sat down and consciously designed that shift. It happened slowly, almost invisibly, through countless small decisions about which plants seemed worth harvesting and replanting, repeated across generations, until an entirely new relationship between people and grain had quietly taken root. Consider for a moment exactly how strange this decision would have looked to anyone watching from the outside. Deliberately burying good food in the dirt, then waiting months trusting an uncertain, unfamiliar process, when hunting and gathering had reliably fed people for the entire span of human existence up to this point. It is easy looking backward with the comfort of knowing exactly how the story turns out, to treat farming as an obvious, inevitable next step. At the time, it would have looked more like a genuine gamble taken only because the old dependable way of gathering food had already begun failing badly enough to make almost any alternative worth trying. It is a strange thing to sit with tonight. The very same abrupt, brutal cold snap that wiped mammoths and giant sloths from the face of the earth may also have been the exact pressure that nudged a handful of desperate, hungry communities toward inventing farming. Loss and invention arriving hand in hand, born from the very same catastrophe. Have you ever noticed how your own worst, most disruptive years often end up teaching you the skills you end up relying on for the rest of your life? There is something oddly familiar about a species doing the exact same thing on a scale of entire continents and thousands of years, forced by circumstance into a solution nobody would have chosen if the old, easier way had simply kept working. There is a certain dark irony worth sitting with here too, one that feels almost too neat to be a coincidence. The very same abrupt climate collapse that ended the age of giant mammals may have simultaneously planted the very first tentative seed of the agricultural revolution that would eventually let human populations grow larger than any single hunting band could ever have imagined. One kind of world ending quietly to make room for another kind of world nobody had asked for and nobody could have predicted. By the time this brutal cold snap finally released its grip roughly 11,600 years ago, the world it left behind looked almost unrecognizable from the one that came before it. The great herds were gone. An old, dependable way of gathering food from the land had quietly become unreliable, perhaps for good. And a small number of increasingly desperate communities scattered across a narrow stretch of the Near East were already carrying forward a new deliberate habit that would before very much longer change the shape of human life more completely than almost anything that came before it. Because not far from those very same struggling wheat fields, a group of people who had never grown a single crop in their entire existence were about to attempt something even stranger. Something that had absolutely nothing to do with farming at all, and everything to do with a single towering question nobody in that valley had ever needed to ask before now. What happens when people who still hunt and gather for every meal decide, for reasons scientists are still arguing about, to build something meant to last forever? Not far from those very same struggling wheat fields, a group of people who had never grown a single crop in their entire existence gathered on a bare hilltop in what is now southeastern Turkey and started doing something that on paper should not have been possible. Picture one of them now, an experienced stoneworker kneeling beside a limestone pillar, taller than 3 grown men standing on each other's shoulders. Around this person, dozens of others haul ropes, brace timber supports, and chip carefully at the surface of the stone, coaxing the outline of a fox out of solid rock. Dust hangs in the warm afternoon air. Somewhere nearby, the smell of roasting meat drifts across the hilltop, carried from cooking pits, where an entire gathered community far larger than any single hunting band could ever be on its own is already preparing for the evening ahead. Nobody here has ever planted a seed on purpose. Nobody here has ever fired a piece of pottery or smelted a scrap of metal. And yet somehow this scattered community of hunters and gatherers is about to raise a ring of monumental stone pillars that will still be standing 11,600 years later. For most of the 20th century, the accepted order of human progress went something like this. First, people settle down and start farming. Farming produces surplus food. Surplus food frees up time and labour. And only then, once a society has that kind of stability, does it turn its attention toward temples, monuments, and organised religion. Agriculture first, everything else after. This hilltop broke that story completely. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt spent nearly 2 decades carefully uncovering this site, a place now called Göbekli Tepe, and what his team found buried under centuries of wind-blown soil upended nearly everything researchers thought they understood about the order in which civilization actually unfolds. Dozens of massive limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing several tons apiece, arranged into large circular enclosures, carved with detailed images of foxes, boars, snakes, cranes, and vultures. And crucially, absolutely no sign of farming anywhere in the earliest layers. No domesticated grain, no livestock pens, just skilled patient hunter-gatherers apparently willing to invest a staggering amount of collective effort into something that fed no one directly at all. Each pillar rises in a distinctive shape, a tall vertical stone topped by a horizontal crosspiece giving the whole structure the unmistakable silhouette of an enormous stylized human figure standing guard over the enclosure. Some carry carved arms bent at the elbow hands, folded gently across the front of the stone, along with belts and small loincloths, etched into the surface, as though the builders wanted these towering slabs of limestone to feel less like architecture and more like company. Schmidt himself came to believe these pillars represented ancestors, or perhaps guardian spirits watching silently over whatever ceremonies took place inside each ring. Say that timeline out loud for a second because it deserves to land properly. This place predates Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years. It predates the earliest Egyptian pyramids by well over 7,000 years. Depending on how you count it, this hilltop may be older than the invention of the wheel, the earliest known writing and organized farming itself, all three at once. So how does a group of people with no metal tools, no draft animals and no wheeled carts manage to quarry-shape transport and raise stone pillars, weighing several tons each? It is worth pausing here to truly picture the physical challenge involved, because it is easy to skim past a sentence like that without fully absorbing it. A single pillar this size moved even a short distance would require dozens of people pulling in careful coordination, timed chants or signals to keep everyone hauling together, and an intimate, hard-won understanding of how stone behaves under strain. One miscalculation, one rope giving way at the wrong moment could easily crush the very people doing the lifting. This was not casual labour. It was dangerous, exacting work undertaken by people who had every reason to walk away and simply hunt for dinner instead. Researchers studying the quarry sites nearby have found partially finished pillars still attached to the bedrock abandoned mid-extraction, offering a rare, almost accidental glimpse into the actual process. Workers appear to have used simple stone hammers and sheer persistence to slowly separate each pillar from the surrounding rock, then dragged it into position using ropes, wooden sledges and raw human muscle, likely supplemented by generous amounts of animal fat as a natural lubricant. None of it was efficient by modern standards. All of it required serious sustained organization among people who, as far as anyone can tell, did not even stay at this site permanently. That detail alone raises a question worth sitting with for a moment. If nobody actually stayed here full-time who was doing all of this work, and why, the answer most researchers currently favour suggests this hilltop functioned as a gathering point, a place where scattered hunting bands from across the wider region would periodically travel to meet, feast and build together before returning to their separate territories. Excavators have found enormous quantities of animal bone fragments scattered across the site, evidence of feasting on a truly large scale, far beyond what any single small band could ever consume on its own. Gazelle bones dominate many of these deposits alongside wild cattle, boar and deer, suggesting organized large-scale hunting trips, timed specifically to supply these gatherings rather than the smaller opportunistic hunting that would have sustained an ordinary family group day to day. Picture what an event like that would have actually felt like from the inside. Families who might normally see only their own small band for months on end suddenly surrounded by dozens, possibly hundreds of unfamiliar faces, all speaking recognizable but slightly different versions of a shared language, all bringing news, marriage prospects and half-remembered stories from territories days of walking away. For people whose entire social world usually numbered a few dozen individuals, a gathering of this size would have felt less like a construction project, and more like the single, most significant social event of an entire year. Bringing that many people together, feeding them and coordinating months of stonework, all without any of the administrative tools we normally associate with complex societies, would have required exactly the kind of dense, cooperative social structure archaeologists once assumed only farming could provide. Here is where the story circles back around in a way that feels almost too neatly connected to be coincidence. Roughly 20 miles from this exact hilltop sits a mountain called Karakada. Geneticists studying the ancestry of modern domesticated wheat have traced its wild origins back to grain populations still growing on the slopes of that very mountain remarkably near this ring of carved stone pillars. Some researchers now suspect that the sheer effort of feeding large temporary crowds gathering here for construction and ritual may have been exactly the kind of pressure that pushed nearby communities toward deliberately managing their local wild grain more intensively, eventually tipping over into full cultivation. Maybe religion ritual and the simple need to feed a crowd came first, and farming followed as a practical solution to an entirely social problem. Maybe farming was already quietly beginning nearby for its own separate reasons, and this hilltop just happened to rise alongside it. Or maybe, and this feels like the most honest way to settle this particular mystery, the two forces fed each other so directly that asking which one came first may be asking the wrong question entirely. A quick question worth sitting with before we move any further. If you had to guess which came first in human history, the temple or the farm, which would you have picked before tonight? Most people guess the farm without a second thought, simply because it seems like the more practical, more obviously necessary step. This hilltop suggests our ancestors may not have been quite so practical after all, at least not in the way we usually assume, meaning connection and belonging may have mattered to them every bit as urgently as an empty stomach. Local farmers had noticed strange, oddly shaped stones scattered across this particular hilltop for generations, long before any archaeologist arrived to take a proper look. Most assumed they were simply unusual rocks, perhaps old grave markers from some more recent forgettable era, not worth much curiosity. It took an outside expert walking the same ground with a different kind of attention to recognize that these were not scattered curiosities at all, but the tip of something enormous still buried beneath centuries of soil. There is one more strange detail worth mentioning before we leave this hilltop behind for tonight. At some point, generation after generation, the builders here appear to have deliberately buried their own finished enclosures under tons of packed rubble and soil, only to raise a brand new ring of pillars nearby on top of the same hill. Nobody currently has a confident explanation for why. Perhaps each enclosure had served its purpose and needed in some ritual sense to be laid to rest. Perhaps burying the old maid room both physically and symbolically for whatever the community needed to build next. Consider the sheer scale of that decision for a moment. Imagine spending months, possibly years, quarrying stone, carving intricate images and raising pillars, weighing several tons, only to deliberately bury the entire finished structure under earth and rubble once its purpose had run its course. To modern eyes trained to treat monuments as permanent achievements, meant to be preserved and admired indefinitely, that decision looks almost wasteful. To the people who made it, burying a completed enclosure may have felt less like destruction, and more like a kind of respectful farewell, the same instinct that guides people today to retire an old ritual gently, rather than simply letting it fade away unnoticed. Now step back for a moment and consider everything this hilltop actually represents, sitting at the very edge of everything this whole journey has walked you through tonight. 100,000 years before this exact moment, a woman ground red pigment into paint on a quiet stretch of African coastline driven by an urge to mark meaning onto the world around her. Her descendants, nearly vanished, entirely clung to survival through a supervolcano's aftermath, carried symbolic thought and careful craftsmanship across oceans no human had ever crossed before, met other kinds of humans and quietly absorbed pieces of them into who we would eventually become, endured an ice age by turning beads and bone into both practical clothing and pure deliberate beauty, told the very first stories anyone knows of through paint, on stone-pressed footprints into a continent nobody imagined reaching, and survived a climate collapse severe enough to end an entire age of giants. And now, on this quiet hilltop, their descendants gathered together with nothing but stone tools and raw determination, and built something meant to outlast every single one of them. Think about the sheer distance that single thread has travelled, ochre ground by hand on a beach at the edge of a nearly empty world, beads carved one by painstaking one to honour someone the cold could not defeat, a pig painted in torchlight thousands of miles and thousands of years apart from that same beach by people who never knew the painter came before them, a footprint pressed into mud beside a giant sloth, and finally an entire community choosing to spend months of hard cooperative labour on something that produced no food, no shelter, and no immediate survival benefit at all, purely because it mattered to them. That is not a random sequence of unconnected events. That is one continuous, unbroken impulse slowly building in confidence and scale across 100,000 years. That is not a story about primitive people slowly fumbling their way toward being modern. That is a story about people exactly like you carrying the exact same instincts you carry tonight, the same pull toward meaning, connection, beauty and belonging, working with whatever tools their moment in history happened to hand them. You're not separate from any of this. The impulse that made someone grind ochre into paint, the instinct that pushed people to cross open water toward a horizon with nothing visible on the other side, the stubborn refusal to let go of beauty even in the harshest imaginable winter, the pull to gather, build and mark a place as meaningful, all of it is still folded somewhere inside you, quietly inherited across roughly 4,000 generations. Civilization did not begin the moment someone finally invented writing or built the first city wall. It began far earlier and far more humbly than that, in small, ordinary acts of care, courage and imagination, repeated patiently across 100,000 years by people who never once thought of themselves as making history. Somewhere on that same Turkish hillside, if you stood quietly long enough among those ancient carved pillars today, you might feel something oddly familiar settle over you. Not distance from these people, closeness to them, the same hands, the same hopes, the same quiet need to matter, echoed forward across 100,000 years into yours. Thank you for spending this long quiet journey with me tonight, all the way from a single handful of red pigment to a ring of ancient stone pillars still standing on a hilltop in Turkey. It has been a privilege to walk you through so much of who we actually are and where all of it truly began. Before you drift off, here is one last thought worth carrying with you into sleep tonight. Somewhere out there at this very moment, someone is grinding coffee for the morning ahead with the same careful attention that once went into grinding ochre. Somewhere a friend is being welcomed with food and warmth, echoing feasts held on a hilltop 11,600 years ago. Somewhere a person is looking up at stars and wondering what it all means, exactly the way people wondered around fires for 100,000 years before them. None of that curiosity, none of that warmth, none of that quiet reach for meaning ever really left us. It simply changed shape generation after generation, carried forward by hands remarkably like your own. Rest well tonight, knowing that everything gentle, curious, and enduring about being human has been carried this far by people no different from you. There are many more of these stories still waiting to be told, and I would love nothing more than to share the next one with you whenever you are ready to return.